This is a podcast from the archives of the BBC Reith Lectures. This lecture in the series The Emerging Mind, given by Villanur S. Ramachandran, was originally broadcast in 2003.
Good evening and welcome to the Royal Institution for the first of the Reith Lectures 2003. This year the lectures are called The Emerging Mind and they're being given by one of the world's leading brain scientists, Villanur Ramachandran. Ramachandran is a man of great academic distinction, but he's also a scientific detective. His exploration of the human brain has taken him across the frontier of neuroscience into the worlds of psychology and philosophy. By asking questions about why the human brain works in a certain way, why it believes some things and not others, why it discriminates between, say, the humdrum and the artistic, he's begun to tackle fundamental issues. What do we mean by belief? What is self? What is consciousness? Ramachandran was born in India, where he trained as a doctor. Fascinated by the human mind, he came to Britain and studied in Cambridge and in Oxford. He then moved to the world's most important centre for neuroscience in San Diego, California, where today he's director of the Centre for Brain and Cognition. In this series of 5 lectures, we'll be discovering how science, which has helped us to understand the human body, is now in the process of helping us to unlock the secrets of its mind. We'll learn how it can bring empirical research to bear on philosophical questions about who we are and what we feel. With us tonight is an audience of scientists, psychologists, thinkers and writers who will debate the issues raised by our lecturer afterwards. But first, please welcome our Reith lecturer for 2003, Professor Villanur Ramachandran.
The history of mankind in the last 300 years has been punctuated by major upheavals in human thought that we call scientific revolutions. Upheavals that have profoundly influenced the way in which we view ourselves and our place in the cosmos. First, there was the Copernican revolution, the notion that far from being the center of the universe, our planet is a mere speck of dust revolving around the sun. Then there was the Darwinian revolution, culminating in the view that we are not angels, but merely hairless apes, as Huxley once pointed out in this very room. And third, there was Freud's discovery of the unconscious, the idea that even though we claim to be in charge of our destinies, most of our behavior is governed by a cauldron of motives and emotions which we are barely conscious of. Your conscious life, in short, is nothing but an elaborate post hoc rationalization of things you really do for other reasons. But now we are poised for the greatest revolution of all, understanding the human brain. This will surely be a turning point in the history of the human species, for unlike those earlier revolutions in science, this one is not about the outside world, not about cosmology or biology or physics, but about ourselves, about the very organ that made those earlier revolutions possible. And I want to emphasize that these insights into the human brain will have a profound impact not just on us scientists, but also on the humanities. And indeed, they may even help us bridge what C.P. Snow called the two cultures, science on the one hand, and arts, philosophy, and humanities on the other. I'd like to thank the BBC for inviting me to give the 2003 Reith Lectures. I hope the lectures will appeal to a broad audience, fulfilling Lord Reith's original mission. Given the enormous amount of research on the brain, all I can do is to provide a very impressionistic survey rather than try to be comprehensive. Of course, by doing this, I will be oversimplifying many of the issues involved and run the risk of annoying some of my specialist colleagues. But as Lord Reith himself once said, there are some people whom it is one's duty to offend. Although the lectures will cover a very wide spectrum of topics, there will be 2 recurring themes that run through all of them. The first broad theme is that by studying neurological syndromes that have been largely ignored as curiosities or mere anomalies, we can sometimes acquire novel insights into the functions of the normal brain. The second theme is that many of the functions of the brain are best understood from an evolutionary vantage point. The human brain, it has been said, is the most complexly organized structure in the universe. And to appreciate this, you just have to look at some numbers. The brain is made up of 100 billion nerve cells or neurons, which are the basic structural and functional units of the nervous system. Each neuron makes something like 1,000 to 10,000 contacts with other neurons. And these points of contact are called synapses, where exchange of information occurs. And based on this information, someone has calculated that the number of possible permutations and combinations of brain activity, in other words, the number of brain states, exceeds the number of elementary particles in the known universe. Even though it's common knowledge these days, it never ceases to amaze me that all the richness of our mental life, all our feelings, our emotions, our thoughts, our ambitions, our love life, our religious sentiments, and even what each of us regards as his own intimate, private self, is simply the activity of these little specks of jelly in your head, in your brain. There is nothing else. Given the staggering complexity, where do you even begin? Well, let's start with some basic anatomy. It's the 21st century, and most people here have a rough idea of what the brain looks like. It's got two mirror image halves called the cerebral hemispheres, so it looks like a walnut sitting on top of a stalk called the brain stem. And each hemisphere of the brain is divided into 4 lobes: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. The occipital lobe in the back is concerned with vision. If it's damaged, you become blind. The temporal lobe is concerned with things like hearing, with emotions, and certain aspects of perception. The parietal lobes of the brain are concerned with the sides of the head. They're concerned with creating a 3-dimensional representation of the spatial layout of the external world and also of your own body in that 3-dimensional representation. And lastly, the frontal lobes in the front are the most mysterious of all. They're concerned with some very enigmatic aspects of human mind and human behavior, such as your moral sense, your wisdom, your ambition, and other activities of the mind which we know very little about. Now, there are several ways of studying the brain, but my approach is to look at people who have had some sort of damage to a small part of the brain or some change in a small part of the brain. And interestingly, when you look at these people who have had a small lesion in a specific part of the brain, what you see is not an across-the-board reduction in all their cognitive capacities, not a blunting of their mind. What you see is often a highly selective loss of one specific function, with other functions being preserved intact. And this gives you some confidence in asserting that that part of the brain is somehow involved in mediating that function. You're going to see many examples of this in my lectures, but just to give you a flavor for this kind of research, I'm just going to mention 2 or 3 of my favorite examples. One of my favorites is prosopagnosia, or face blindness. When there is damage to a structure called the fusiform gyrus in the temporal lobes on both sides of the brain, what you get is a patient who can no longer recognize people's faces. Now, the patient isn't blind because he can still read a book, and he's not psychotic or obviously mentally disturbed, but he can no longer recognize faces by looking at people. Now, that syndrome is very well known, but there is another syndrome that is quite rare, and that's what we call the Capgras syndrome. And I'll give you an example of this. A patient I saw not long ago who had been in a car accident, had sustained a head injury, and was in a coma for about a couple of weeks. Then he came out of this coma, and he was quite intact neurologically when I examined him, but he had one profound delusion. He would look at his mother and say, "Doctor, this woman looks exactly like my mother, but she isn't. She's an imposter." Okay? Now, why would this happen? Now, the important thing is this patient, whom I will call David, is completely intact in other respects. Now, to understand this disorder, you have to first realize that vision is not a simple process. You open your eyes in the morning, it's all out there in front of you. It's easy to assume that it's effortless and instantaneous. But in fact, you have this distorted upside-down image in your retina exciting the photoreceptors, and the messages then go through the optic nerve to the brain, and then they are analyzed in 30 different visual areas in the back of your brain. And then you finally, after analyzing all the individual features, you identify what you're looking at. Is it your mother? Is it a snake? Is it a pig? What is it? And that process of identification takes place in a place which we call the fusiform gyrus. which, as we have seen, is damaged in patients with face blindness or prosopagnosia. So once the image is recognized, then the message goes to a structure called the amygdala, which is sometimes called the gateway to the limbic system, which is the emotional core of your brain, which allows you to gauge the emotional significance of what you're looking at. Is this a predator? Is it a lion or a tiger? Is it a prey which I can chase? Is it a mate that I can chase? Or is it my departmental chairman I have to worry about? Or is it a stranger who's not important to me? Or something utterly trivial like a piece of driftwood? What is it? What's happened in this patient? What we suggest is that maybe what's gone wrong is that the fusiform gyrus and all the visual areas are completely normal in this patient. That's why when he looks at his mother, he says, oh, yeah, it looks like my mother. But the wire, to put it crudely, the wire that goes from the amygdala to the limbic system, to the emotional centers, is cut by the accident. So he looks at his mother and he says, hey, it looks just like my mother, but if it's my mother, why is it I don't experience this warm glow of affection or terror, as the case may be? Okay? There's something strange here. This can't possibly be my mother. It's some other strange woman pretending to be my mother. It's the only interpretation that makes sense to his brain, given the peculiar disconnection. Now, how do you test an outlandish idea like this? My student Bill Herstein and I in La Jolla, and Hayden Ellis and Andrew Young here in England, did some very simple experiments measuring galvanic skin response, which I'll talk about in detail in my last lecture. And we found, sure enough, there has been this disconnection between vision and emotion as predicted by our theory, just as we had thought. Now, what's even more amazing is when David, this patient who, when he saw his mother, said she's an imposter, an hour later his mother phones him, and he picks up the phone and answers the phone, and he says, Mom, how are you? Where are you? Instantly he recognizes her. There is no delusion. An hour later the mother walks into the room and he says, who are you? You look just like my mother, but you're an imposter. You're not my mother. Now, why does this happen? Well, it turns out there's a separate pathway going from the auditory cortex in the superior temporal gyrus to the amygdala. And that pathway, perhaps, is not cut by the accident. That's why when he listens to his mother on the phone, he says, oh my God, this is my mom, where are you? But when he sees her, the delusion kicks in immediately and he says, who are you? Now, there are many other twists to the story, which I'm going to tell you about in my last lecture on neuropsychiatry. But I thought I'd just mention it briefly today because it's a lovely example of the sort of thing we do, of cognitive neuroscience in action. Now, we've talked about visual response to visual images, your emotional response to visual images. Obviously, this response is vital for your survival. But the existence of connections between visual brain centers and the limbic system, or emotional core of the brain, also raises another interesting question. And that is, what is art? How does the brain respond to beauty? Given that these connections are between vision and emotion, and art involves an aesthetic, emotional response to visual images, surely these connections must be involved. And this is a topic I'll take up in my lecture in Birmingham. Now, we've been talking about all these intricate connections in the brain, in the limbic system, in the visual centers, in the amygdala. An obvious question is the question of nature versus nurture. In other words, are these connections laid down by the genome in the fetus, or are they acquired in early infancy as the infant interacts with the world, the so-called nature-nurture debate? This takes me to the next syndrome I'd like to talk to you about, and that is phantom limbs. Everyone here knows what a phantom limb is. A patient has an arm amputated because there's a tumor, a malignant tumor in the arm, or there's been a car accident and the arm has to be amputated. But the patient continues to vividly feel the presence of that arm. Some of you here, this being England, would know about Lord Nelson, who vividly felt a phantom arm. I'll tell you about an experiment we did on these patients. So we have a patient with a phantom left arm. His arm had been amputated above the left elbow. So I had him sitting in my office, blindfolded, and I took a Q-tip and touched different parts of the body and asked him, what do you feel? I touched his shoulder and he said, oh, you're touching my shoulder. I touched his belly and he said, oh, you're touching my belly. I touched his chest and he said, you're touching my chest. Not surprising. But the amazing thing is when we touched his face, the left side of his face, remember his left arm is amputated, so he has a phantom on the left side. When I touched his cheek, he said, oh my God, doctor, you're touching my left thumb, my missing phantom thumb. And he seemed as surprised as I was. Then I touched him here, and he said, on the upper lip, and he said, "Oh my God, you're touching my phantom index finger." And then on his lower jaw, and he said, "You're touching my phantom pinky, my little finger." So why does this happen? There was a complete map, a systematic map of the missing phantom hand on his face, draped on his face. So you have a medical mystery of sorts, the sort of mystery we saw with David, the patient with Capgras syndrome, the sort of mystery that would have intrigued Sherlock Holmes, Conan Doyle, or Bertrand Rocher. So what's going on? To answer this question, you have to look at the anatomy of the brain again. The entire skin surface, touch signals, all the skin surface on the left side of the brain, is mapped onto the right cerebral hemisphere on a vertical strip of cortical tissue called the postcentral gyrus. Actually, there are several maps, but I'll simplify it and pretend there's only one map called the postcentral gyrus. Now, this is a faithful representation of the entire body surface. It's almost as though you have a little person draped on the surface of the brain. It's called the Penfield homunculus. And for the most part, it's continuous, which is what you mean by a map. But there is one peculiarity, and that is the representation of the face on this map, on the surface of the brain, is right next to the representation of the hand on this map, instead of being near the neck where it should be. So it's dislocated. Now, nobody knows why. Something to do with phylogeny or the way in which the brain develops in early fetal life or in early infancy. But that's the way the map is. So I realized that what's going on here is when you amputate the arm, the part of the cortex of the brain corresponding to the hand is not receiving any signals because you've removed the hand. So it's hungry for sensory input. So what happens is the sensory input from the face skin now invades the vacated territory corresponding to the missing hand. And that then is misinterpreted by higher centers in the brain as arising from the missing phantom hand. And that's why the patient says, every time you touch his face, he says, "Oh, that's my phantom thumb you're touching. That's my phantom index finger. That's my phantom pinky." In fact, you can even put an ice cube on the face, and the patient will say, "Oh, my thumb is ice cold." If you can put a drop of hot water, in fact, we put a drop of hot water, the water started trickling down the face, the patient will trace the trickle on his phantom with his normal hand, following its path. On one occasion, we had the patient raise his phantom, and he was amazed to feel the trickle going uphill, which is against the law of physics. Now, that's just a hypothesis, but to test this idea, we used a brain imaging technique called MEG, or magnetoencephalography, which allows you to see which parts of the brain light up when you touch different parts of the body. And sure enough, what we found was in this patient, Victor, unlike the normal brain, when you touch his face, it activated not only the face area in the brain, but also activated the hand region of the Penfield map in the brain. So there's obviously been this cross-wiring in the brain of this patient. And this is important because it allows you to link changes in brain anatomy, changes in brain maps, in the sensory maps, with phenomenology. Allows you to link physiology and psychology, which is one of the goals of cognitive neuroscience, this discipline we were talking about. Now, the discovery also has broader implications. One of the things we're all taught as medical students is that connections in the brain are laid down in the fetus or in early infancy. And once they're laid down, there's nothing much you can do to change these connections in the adult. And that's why when there's damage to the nervous system, as in a stroke, there is such little recovery of function, and why neurological ailments are so notoriously difficult to treat. Well, what I'm saying is that's wrong. In fact, there's a tremendous amount of plasticity or malleability even in the adult brain. And you can demonstrate this in a 5-minute experiment in a patient with a phantom limb. Now, how you go about harnessing this ability in the clinic, maybe to help patients recover from stroke or indeed from phantom limb pain, is a question that we don't have time to go into, but we can take up during discussions. Okay, so we've seen that after an arm amputation, the patient's brain gets cross-wired. The face input now innervates the hand region of the brain. Now that happens because of amputation. It turns out that the same thing can happen because of a mutation. If there is something wrong with your genes, instead of the brain modules remaining segregated, you get this accidental cross-wiring. And then you get a curious condition called synesthesia, which we have now been studying. This is going to be a topic of my lecture in Oxford. Briefly, it was described by Francis Galton, or clearly documented by him in the 19th century. He pointed out that some people who are perfectly normal in other respects have one peculiar symptom, if you want to call it a symptom. And that is, these people, who are otherwise completely normal, they get their senses mixed up. And that is, every time they hear a particular tone, they see a particular color. So C sharp is red. F sharp is blue. Another tone might be indigo. Okay? And this phenomenon, this mingling of senses, is called synesthesia. Galton pointed out also that it runs in families. We and others have confirmed this, including Simon Baron-Cohen. Now, another aspect of this syndrome is, whenever you hear a particular tone, you see a particular color. Some of these people also, when they see numbers in black and white, like the number 5 or the number 6 or the number 7, what we call Arabic numerals, Indian numerals, strictly speaking, okay? When you see these numbers, every time you see a number, it evokes a particular color. So 5 is always red, 6 is always green, is always tinged green, 7 is always indigo, 8 is always yellow. So this, again, is another example of synesthesia. And it's very common. We find it's about 1 in 200 people have this. So it's not as rare as people have thought it to be in the past. Now, why does this happen? Why does this mixing of signals occur? Well, a student of mine, Ed Hubbard, and I were looking at brain atlases, brain maps, and we were struck by the fact that if you look at the fusiform gyrus, that's where color information is analyzed. But amazingly, the number area of the brain, which represents visual graphemes of numbers, 5, 6, 7, 8, and all of that, is right next to it, also in the fusiform gyrus, almost touching it. So we said this can't be a coincidence. Maybe in some people, there is some accidental cross-wiring. Just as after amputation, you get cross-wiring between the face and the hand, in these people, maybe there's a cross-wiring between the number and color area in the fusiform gyrus. Of course, the key difference is, in the case of phantom limbs, it's the amputation that causes the reorganization, whereas in synesthesia, given that it runs in families, we think it's caused by a gene or a set of genes, which causes abnormal connections between adjacent brain regions. In this case, between numbers and colors. So every time he sees a specific number, it evokes a particular color. First of all, many neurologists, neuroscientists in the past, even though the phenomenon was described by Galton 100 years ago, it's been regarded mainly as a curiosity. It sounds crazy. They're just crazy, or they're just faking it to draw attention to themselves, or maybe it's childhood memories. You played with refrigerator magnets. 5 was red, 6 was blue, 7 was green. Now, it never made much sense to me, because why does it then run in families? You have to say maybe the same magnets were passed down. So first thing we wanted to show was this is a real phenomenon. The person genuinely sees red when he sees 5. It's not just imagination or memory. How do you show that? So we devised a simple display on the computer screen, a number of 5s scattered on the screen, black 5s, just black and white. Embedded among those 5s are a number of 2s. And these 2s form a shape like a triangle, a hidden shape, a triangle or a square. Now, when all of us here, any one of us normals, or less gifted individuals, looks at this pattern, you see nothing. But when a synesthete looks at it, who sees numbers as colored, he sees the 5s as red and the 2s as green. So he looks at it and he says, my God, instantly the 2s pop out. And he says, oh, they're forming a triangle, they're forming a square. And they're much better at doing this than normal people. So it's a clinical test for discovering synesthetes. Now, the fact that synesthetes are actually better at this than normal people suggests that they can't be crazy. If they're crazy, how come they're better at it? Okay? So this shows this is a genuine sensory phenomenon. It also shows this can't be memory association or something cognitive or a metaphor, because if that were true, how come he's able to see the triangle or the square pop out from the background? Okay, we have shown that this phenomenon is real. We in La Jolla, and as well as Jeffrey Gray and Mike Morgan and others here in London, have done experiments to test the idea there's actual cross-wiring in the brain, and shown that, in fact, there's activation in the fusiform gyrus in the color area, just showing numbers to these people. But then the next question is, okay, here are some people with some quirk in the brain. They see numbers as colored. So what's the big deal? Why should I care? Well, now I'm going to show you that you're all synesthetes, but you're in denial about it. So what I want you to do is I want you all to imagine two shapes in front of you. I wish I had a slide, but of course this is radio. One of them, imagine, is a shattered piece of glass with jagged edges. The other is like an amoeba. It's got undulating, curvy shapes. And one of them I'm going to call a booba, and the other is kiki. Which is which? Now the amazing thing is 98% of people will pick the shattered piece of glass with the jagged edges. They'll say, oh, that's a kiki. And the undulating amoeboid shape, they'll say, oh, that's a booba. Even though they've never seen the shape before, why does this happen? Well, I suggest it happens, and I'm going to talk about this in detail in my Oxford lecture, because you're all synesthetes. Now, we've talked about several syndromes, phantom limb, synesthesia, Capgras syndrome, and these are quite bizarre, and we've tried to explain it in terms of neural circuitry in the brain. But there's a syndrome that's even more bizarre, okay? And this is pain asymbolia. I'll tell you about a patient I saw in Vellore in India about 10 years ago. He was quite normal, intellectually normal, mentally quite lucid, alert, attentive. His memory was normal, perception, everything was fine. Except I took a needle and pricked him with a needle to determine the intact, not to be sadistic, but to determine the intactness of his pain pathways, to determine his pain sensations. And every time I poked him, of course, all of you here would say, ouch. He started giggling, telling me, doctor, I feel the pain, but it doesn't hurt. It feels very funny, like a tickle. And he would start laughing uncontrollably. Here is the ultimate irony, a human being laughing in the face of pain. Okay? Why would the patient do this? Well, seeing this patient made me ask an even more basic question. Why does anybody laugh? Why do all of you here laugh? Now, a Martian ethologist watching all of you here would be very surprised. Every now and then, it's a species-specific trait, laughter. Every now and then, all of you here, stop what you're doing, shake your head, make this funny, staccato, rhythmic sound, hyena-like sound. Why do you do it? Now, clearly laughter is hardwired. It's a universal trait. You see it every society, every civilization, every culture has some form of laughter and humor, except the Germans. So this suggests strongly that it's hardwired in the brain. And this raises an interesting question. Why did it evolve in the brain? How did it evolve through natural selection? When you look at all jokes and humor across societies, the common denominator of all jokes and humor, despite all the diversity, is that you take a person along a garden path of expectation, and at the very end you suddenly introduced an unexpected twist that entails a complete reinterpretation of all the previous facts. That's called the punchline of the joke. Now, obviously, that's not sufficient for laughter, because then every great scientific discovery or every paradigm shift would be funny. And my scientific colleagues wouldn't find it amusing if I said their discoveries were funny. Okay? The key ingredient here is it's not merely sufficient that you introduce a reinterpretation, but the reinterpretation, the new model you've come up with, should be inconsequential. It should be of trivial consequence. It sounds a bit abstract, so let me illustrate with a concrete example. Here is a portly gentleman walking along. He's trying to reach his destination, but before he does that, he slips on a banana peel and falls. And then he breaks his head, and blood spills out. And obviously, you're not going to laugh. You're going to rush to the telephone and call the ambulance. But imagine, instead of that, he walks along, slips in the banana peel, falls, wipes off the goo from his face, looks around him everywhere, and then gets up. Then you start laughing. The reason is, I claim, is because now you know it's inconsequential. You say, oh, it's no big deal. There's no real danger here. So what I'm arguing is, laughter is nature's false alarm. Why is this useful from an evolutionary standpoint? You say, don't waste your resources rushing to his aid. So what you're doing with this rhythmic staccato sound of laughter is informing your kin who share your genes, don't waste your precious resources rushing to this person's aid. It's a false alarm. Everything is okay. So it's nature's okay signal. Now, what's this got to do with my patient in Vellore? Well, let me explain. When we examined his brain, when we did a CT scan, we found there was damage to the region called the insular cortex on the sides of the brain. The insular cortex receives pain signals from the viscera and from the skin. That's where you experience the raw sensation of pain. But it turns out there are many layers to pain. It's not just a unitary thing. From the insular cortex, the message goes to the amygdala, which we encountered earlier in the context of the Capgras syndrome, and then to the rest of the limbic system, and especially the anterior cingulate, where you respond emotionally to the pain, to the agony of pain, and take the appropriate action. So my idea was maybe what's happened in this patient is the insular cortex is normal. That's why he says, doctor, I can feel the pain. But the wire that goes from the insula to the rest of the limbic system and the anterior cingulate is cut. Therefore, you have the two key ingredients you need for laughter in humor. Namely, one part of the brain signaling a potential danger. My God, there's something painful here. But the very next instant, the anterior cingulate says, but I'm not getting any signal. Big deal, there is no danger here. Forget it. So you've got the two key ingredients, and the patient starts laughing and giggling uncontrollably. So it's a disconnection similar to what we saw with the Capgras patient. So we've seen several syndromes here which suggest that you can look at neurological oddities, neurological syndrome, and learn a great deal about the functions of the normal brain. I would like to conclude with a quotation from my previous book, Phantoms in the Brain. There is something distinctly odd about a hairless neotenous primate that has evolved into a species that can look back over its own shoulder to ponder its own origins. Odder still, the brain can not only discover how other brains work, but also ask questions about itself. Who am I? What is the meaning of my existence? Especially if you're from India. Why do I laugh? Why do I dream? Why do I enjoy art, music, and poetry? Does my mind consist entirely of the activity of neurons in my brain? If so, what scope is there for free will? It is the peculiar recursive quality of these questions, as the brain struggles to understand itself, that makes neurology so fascinating. The prospect of answering these questions in the next millennium is both exhilarating and disquieting, but it's surely the greatest adventure that our species has ever embarked upon. So I hope you'll stay with me for all the remaining lectures. Thank you very much.
Professor Ramachandran, Rama, as we call you, thank you very much indeed. Breathtaking stuff, but prompts all sorts of questions. It occurs to me that if you think your mother is an imposter, who on earth do you think everybody else is? And is it possible to feel other missing parts of your body, like a womb or a breast, all sorts of things, and loftier questions, of course, about, as we heard, about consciousness and self-will. Let me invite our audience now here at the Royal Institution in London to debate these and other issues which Rama has raised. Can I have a first question, please? Gentleman there.
Geoffrey Gray from the Institute of Psychiatry. Rama, you dropped an intriguing hint that the plasticity of the brain that you've been describing can be put to clinical use. I think it would be nice to know a little bit more about that if you've time.
I'm tempted to quote Faraday, who said that it doesn't matter, But to answer your question, one of the things we've seen is many patients with phantom limbs, they can move their phantom. They'll say, it reaches out to grab the phone when it rings. It waves goodbye. It's patting my brother on the shoulder, and so on and so forth. But some patients with phantom limbs, about a third, claim that the phantom is paralyzed. And they'll say things like it's fixed in an awkward position, and they'll mimic the position with the other hand and say it's like this, and it's cramped, and it's painful, excruciatingly painful. I wish I could move it because it might relieve the pain, but I can't. So why does this happen? Well, one of the things we found was some of these patients, before the amputation, had a pre-existing nerve damage, and the arm was actually paralyzed and lying in a sling. And then you amputate the arm, you're stuck with a phantom that's paralyzed in the same manner. So we call this learned paralysis. The idea is when the arm was intact but paralyzed, every time the front of the brain sent a command to the arm saying, move, it was getting visual feedback saying, no, move, no, it's not moving. And somehow this gets stamped into the circuitry in the parietal lobe of somewhere in the brain. Then you amputate the arm, the paralysis carries over into the phantom. So we said, how do you test this outlandish theory? So we said, why not give them visual feedback that the phantom is obeying the command? So we hit on the idea of using a mirror, and then you ask him to put his phantom on the left side of the mirror. Let's assume his left arm is a phantom. And you put his right arm, his real arm, intact arm, on the right side of the mirror, and he looks at the reflection of the normal arm in the mirror. It's as though you've resurrected his phantom visually. Now you say make mirror symmetric movements, as though you're conducting an orchestra or something. And the amazing thing is, of course, now he's getting visual feedback that the phantom is obeying his commands. And what we found was, in many patients who have a cramped phantom, If you simply move the normal arm and look in the mirror, so it looks like your phantom is opening and closing its hand or moving, it somehow seems to suddenly animate or liberate the phantom. So suddenly the phantom starts moving, and many patients have told us this feels good. In fact, we've had patients where they do this repeatedly, the entire phantom vanishes. And I tell my medical colleagues this is the first example of a successful amputation of a phantom limb.
We in fact have here someone, an amputee, Norman Croucher, who I think you have no legs below the knee. Is that right, Norman?
Yes.
Does this ring any bells with you?
Well, I've got a phantom foot with the big toe is twisted underneath, quite tight. But mine
painful.
Was not painful though. Not painful. Mine was not as a long-term injury anyway. Mine was a very quick job done by British Rail several years ago. So what I wanted to ask is, I gather that there's evidence that the use of an epidural prior to an amputation can reduce the incidence of phantom limb pain. If that is so, is there any evidence to show that those who have suffered phantom limb pain after an amputation carried out without an epidural can be freed of that pain if they have a subsequent shortening of the limb after an epidural? Might that tiniest bit of deliberate amputation actually relieve the phantom limb pain, or there might be a risk of acquiring another painful phantom limb on top of the one you've already got?
You're asking several questions, not just one.
Can I ask you for a brief answer, because I want to broaden it out?
Okay. There's some reports from the Canadian literature that if you do a spinal block, or indeed an epidural, this somehow blocks the pain temporarily, and then you do the amputation. This reduces the incidence of post-amputation phantom pain memories. But there are other reports claiming that that's not true, so it's still not clear.
The woman behind that one, yes.
Susie Orbach. I have patients who have a very troubled experience of their bodies, sometimes so troubled that they don't experience that they have a body. Some of them are driven to cut themselves as a way to make manifest the fact that they are material beings. Now, I want to know whether you would expect that a psychological condition of not having a subjective sense of your body, which then leads you to have this desperate act, would then structure the neurocircuitry in a particular way? And if so, where would you look for it?
That's a very good question. I was planning to touch on this in my last lecture on neuropsychiatry, and actually you should be asking Chris Firth this question. By the way, there is a strange syndrome called Cotard syndrome, where a patient says, I'm dead, and I can smell my own rotting flesh. We think this is an extreme example of Capgras. In other words, if it's a visual disconnection from the amygdala, you get Capgras. My mother is an imposter. But imagine all the sensory information gets disconnected from the amygdala and from the limbic system. Then nothing in the world evokes any emotions. And perhaps the only way the brain can deal with this, the patient can deal with this, is to either say, the entire world is a dream, I'm walking in a dream, or I am dead, I don't exist. And you see both kinds of interpretations.
Let's move on to what is art, which is one of the questions you posed, which you're also going to deal with in a later lecture. But anyway, I see sitting here Anthony Gormley, who, of course, famously gave us the Angel of the North. Anthony, have you got a question?
Hello, Rama. Yes, I'm just absolutely fascinated by the way tonight has unfolded, because, in fact, what you seem to be doing is folding the brain back into the body. And I'd never heard about the Penfield homunculus. But I suppose my question is, well, where do the other brain functions come from that have, as it were, nothing to do with bodily perception? Can there be a consciousness of consciousness itself?
Well, I was worried about somebody asking this. It's a very legitimate question, but as another Reith lecturer, Peter Merwa, once said, science is the art of the soluble. In other words, we like to look at simple questions first, such as, how do you see color? How do you see motion? We know there's one little area in the back of the brain called MT, the middle temporal area, that's concerned just with seeing motion. So we can ask, how does the circuitry there enable you to see movement? And you can study it in intricate detail. So what I'm trying to say here is that you can home in on specific questions in specific regions of the brain, and hopefully someday begin to address those more lofty questions like, what is the self? Can the self view itself? And so on and so forth. I don't think it's like DNA and heredity, where you have one climactic solution. I don't think consciousness is like that. I think you've got many problems like how do you have an embodied self? What do you mean by self-awareness? What do you mean by willing and action? What gives rise to the raw feel of sensations? And eventually, by answering all of these questions piecemeal, that question of what is consciousness will recede to the background, just as we no longer ask, what is life? You know it's a DNA molecule. And I think that may well be true of the human mind.
Gentleman here.
Peter Halligan, Cardiff University. Rama, you focused on two central themes that were motivating the connection between your talks, and one of them related to the explanation of brain function in terms of evolution. What is the purpose, do you think, of having a phantom limb, and what could be the explanation for the 70% of people who actually have pain associated with it?
Yeah, I mean, when I said you need to have an evolutionary perspective, it doesn't follow that every quirk of human behavior, every symptom you see has an evolutionary function. It could be a byproduct of something else that's evolved for a specific function.
Rama, we've all got phantom limbs. We all have a body image by virtue of the fact that we have a cerebral representation of our limbs. When we lose the limb but keep the cortex, of course we have a phantom. There's no evolutionary function in that.
Sure. I think Jonathan has answered your question for me. But let me emphasize also that, in a sense, your body is a phantom, as Jonathan just pointed out.
This was Jonathan Miller.
And again, not everything you see in clinical medicine, some sort of phenomenon like phantom limbs, has an evolutionary function. I would say it's a consequence of the way in which the brain is wired up to represent your body. When you amputate, you continue to feel the presence of the limb. Going back to the lower limb amputation, as you would predict, if you look at the Penfield map, the representation of the genitals, oddly enough, is right next to where the representation of the foot is. And we have had many telephone calls and letters and emails from patients who claim that after amputation of the foot, stimulation of the genitals actually produces sensations in the phantom foot. In fact, one gentleman kept insisting, he said that he actually experienced his orgasm in the phantom foot. And in fact, therefore, it's much bigger than it used to be.
So we can say we went to the first Reith Lecture 2003 and we went home with an explanation of why toe sucking is so successful. We could go on, and we shall. Next week we'll be in Edinburgh at the International Conference Centre for the second of the lectures, which will be focusing even more on self-awareness and consciousness. If you've driven for an hour along a busy motorway and don't remember doing it, you'll understand the kind of territory we're going to get into. My thanks to our audience here in London for launching us on this exploration of the emerging mind, and thank you, of course, to our Reith Lecture 2003, Villanor Ramachandran from the Royal Institution. Good night.
Thank you.
Good evening and welcome to the Edinburgh International Conference Centre, where tonight Villanor Ramachandran, brain detective extraordinary, continues his description of how one day we might crack the mystery of consciousness. Last week, in the first of these lectures, Rama described what he calls phantoms in the brain, some of the curious neurological conditions he's come across in patients which provide clues to how the normal human brain works. This week, he focuses on what we see and how we see it, information which is leading us to confront such lofty questions as what is self? What is this concept that we call human nature? Though stunning in their implications, Ramachandran's ideas, as you'll know if you heard his first lecture, are clear and accessible. So you're required to be neither brain surgeon nor philosopher to participate, which I'm sure our audience here in Edinburgh will be relieved to hear. I simply say to them that you're here, in a sense, on behalf of the listeners at home, so if there's anything you don't understand, it is your duty to stand up and ask for an explanation. By the way, if you browse through some of the visual illusions on our website, you'll discover for yourself that believing what you see isn't always a good idea. What you see is not always what you get. Which is not true of our lecturer. He is the real McCoy. He's the director of the Center for Brain and Cognition at the University of California, San Diego. Will you please welcome our Reith Lecturer 2003, Professor Villanor Ramachandran.
Our ability to perceive the world around us seems so effortless that we tend to take it for granted. But just think of what's involved. I mean, you have two tiny, upside-down, distorted images inside your eyeballs, but what you see is a vivid three-dimensional world out there in front of you. And this transformation is nothing short of a miracle. How does it come about? Now, one common fallacy is to assume there is an image inside your eyeball, the optical image, exciting photoreceptors on your retina, and then that image is transmitted faithfully along a cable called the optic nerve and displayed on a screen called the visual cortex. Now, this is obviously a logical fallacy, because if you have a screen and an image displayed on a screen in the brain, then you need another little chap in there watching that image. And there is no little chap in your head. And if you think about it, that wouldn't solve the problem either, because then you need another little guy in his head looking at the image in his brain, and so on and so forth, and you get an endless regress of eyes and images and little people without really solving the problem of perception. So the first thing you have to do to understand perception is to get rid of the idea of images in the brain and think instead of transforms or symbolic representations of objects and events in the external world. Just as little squiggles of ink, print or writing, or dashes and dots in a Morse code can symbolize or represent something, even though they don't physically resemble what they're representing. Similarly, the action of nerve cells in your brain, the patterns of firing, represent objects and events in the external world, even though they don't in any way resemble what's out there in the world. Neuroscientists are like cryptographers trying to crack an alien script, an alien code, in this case, the code used by the nervous system to represent objects and events in the external world. So today's lecture will be about the process we call seeing, about how you become consciously aware of things around you. As in our last lecture, I'll begin by telling you about patients who have strange visual defects, and then explore the wider implications of these syndromes for understanding the nature of conscious experience, how the activity of mere specks of jelly in the visual areas of your brain gives rise to all the richness of your conscious experience, the redness of red, your ability to recognize a burglar or your lover. Now, how does that happen? We primates are highly visual creatures, and it turns out we have not just one visual area, the visual cortex, but 30 areas in the back of our brains which enable us to perceive the world. It's not clear why we need so many. Why do you need 30 areas? Why not just one area? But perhaps each of these areas is specialized for a different aspect of vision. For example, one area called V4 seems to be concerned mainly with processing color information, seeing colors, whereas another area in the parietal lobe called MT, or the middle temporal area, is concerned mainly with seeing motion. How do we know this? Well, the most striking evidence comes from patients with tiny lesions that damage just V4, the color area, or just MT, the motion area. So, for example, when V4 is damaged on both sides of the brain, you end up with a syndrome called cortical color blindness, or achromatopsia. And patients with cortical achromatopsia see the world in shades of gray, like a black and white movie. But they have no problem reading a newspaper, or recognizing people's faces, or seeing direction of movement. Conversely, if MT, the middle temporal area, is damaged, the patient becomes motion blind. She can still read books and see colors, but can't tell you which direction something is moving or how fast. For example, there was a woman in Zurich who had this problem. She was terrified to cross the street because, unlike all of us here, she saw the cars on the street not as moving, but as a series of static images, as though lit by a strobe light in a discotheque. She couldn't tell how fast a car was approaching, even though she could read its number plate or tell you what color it was. Even pouring wine into a glass was an ordeal. You and I gauge the rate at which the wine level is rising and slow down appropriately. But she can't do this, so the wine always overflows. All of these abilities that seem so simple and effortless to all of us normal people, it's only when something goes wrong we realize how extraordinarily subtle the mechanisms of vision really are, and how complex a process it really is. Now, even though the anatomy of these 30 visual areas, the seeing areas in the brain, looks bewildering at first, there is an overall pattern which I'll now describe. The message from the eyeball on the retina goes through the optic nerve and goes to two major visual centers in the brain. One of these, I'll call it the old system, the old visual center. It's the evolutionarily ancient center, the old pathway that's in the brain stem, and it's called the superior colliculus. The second pathway goes to the cortex, the visual cortex in the back of the brain, and it's called the new pathway. The new pathway in the cortex is doing most of what we usually think of as vision, like recognizing objects consciously. The old pathway, on the other hand, is involved in locating objects in the visual field so that you can orient to it, swivel your eyeballs towards it, rotate your head towards it, thereby directing your high acuity central foveal region of the retina towards the object, so then you can deploy the new visual pathway and then proceed to identify what the object is and then generate the appropriate behavior for that object. Let me now tell you about an extraordinary neurological syndrome called blind sight, discovered by Larry Weisskranz and Alan Cowie at Oxford. It's been known for more than a century that if the visual cortex, which is part of the new visual pathway, if that's damaged, you become blind. For example, if the right visual cortex is damaged, you're completely blind on the left side. If you look straight, everything to the left side of your nose, you're completely blind to. When examining a patient named GY, who had this type of visual deficit, one half of the visual field completely missing, where he was blind, Weisskranz noticed something really strange. He showed the patient a little spot of light in the blind region. Weisskranz asked him, "What do you see?" And the patient said, "Nothing." And that's what you would expect, given that he's blind. But now, he told the patient, "I know you can't see it, but please reach out and touch it." The patient said, "Well, that's very strange." I mean, he must have thought this is a very eccentric request. I mean, point to this thing which he can't see. So the patient said, I can't see it. How can I point to it? Weisskranz said, "Well, just try anyway. Take a guess." The patient then reaches out to touch the object, and imagine the researcher's surprise when the patient reaches out and points to it accurately. Points to the dot that he cannot consciously perceive. After hundreds of trials, it became obvious that he could point accurately on 99% of trials, even though he claimed on each trial that he was just guessing. He said he didn't know if he was getting it right or not. From his point of view, it might as well have been an experiment on ESP. The staggering implication of this is that the patient was accurately able to point to an object he denied being able to see. How is this possible? How do you explain his ability to infer the location of an invisible object and point to it accurately? The answer is obvious. As I said, GY has damage to his visual cortex, the new pathway, which is why he's blind. But remember, he still has the old pathway, the other pathway, going through his brainstem and superior colliculus as a backup. So even though the message from the eyes and optic nerves doesn't reach the visual cortex, given that the visual cortex is damaged, they take the parallel route to the superior colliculus, which allows him to locate the object in space, and the message then gets relayed to higher brain centers in the parietal lobes that guide the hand movement accurately to point to the invisible object. It's as if even though GY, the person, the human being, is oblivious to what's going on, there's another unconscious zombie trapped in him who can guide the hand movement with uncanny accuracy. This explanation suggests that only the new pathway is conscious. Events in the old pathway, going through the colliculus and guiding the hand movement, can occur without you, the person, being conscious of it. Why? Why should one pathway alone, or its computational style perhaps, lead to conscious awareness, whereas neurons in a parallel part of the brain, the old pathway, can carry out even complex computations without being conscious? Why should any brain event be associated with conscious awareness, given the existence proof that the old pathway through the colliculus can do its job perfectly well without being conscious? Why can't the rest of the brain do without consciousness? Why can't it all be blind sight, in other words? We can't answer this question directly yet, but as scientists, the best we can do is to establish correlations and try and home in on the answer. We can make a list of all brain events that reach consciousness and a list of those brain events that don't. We can then compare the two lists and ask, is there a common denominator in each list that distinguishes it from the other? Is it only certain styles of computation that lead to consciousness, or perhaps certain anatomical locations that are linked to being conscious? That's a tractable empirical question. And once we tackle that, it might get us closer to answering what the function of consciousness might be, if any, and why it evolved. Now, I should add that the blind sight syndrome in GY seemed so bizarre when it was first discovered that it was greeted with skepticism. And some of my colleagues don't believe that it even exists. Well, partly this is because the syndrome is very rare, but also partly because it seems to violate common sense. How can you point to something you don't see? But actually, that's not a good reason for rejecting it, because in a sense, we all suffer from blind sight. Now, that sounds cryptic, so let me explain that. Imagine you're driving your car and having a lively, animated, intimate conversation with your friend sitting next to you. Your attention is entirely on the conversation. It's what you're conscious of. But in parallel, you're negotiating traffic, avoiding the pavement, avoiding pedestrians, not running red lights, and performing all these very complex, elaborate computations without being really conscious of any of it, unless something strange happens, like you see an actual zebra instead of just a zebra crossing. So in a sense, you are not any different from GY, all of you here. You have blind sight for driving and negotiating traffic. What we see in GY is simply an especially florid version of blind sight, unmasked by disease. But his predicament is not fundamentally different from yours and mine. Intriguingly, you cannot imagine the converse scenario, paying conscious attention to driving and negotiating traffic while unconsciously having a creative conversation with your friend. This may sound trivial, but it's a thought experiment. And it's already telling you something valuable, that computations involved in meaningful use of language require consciousness, but those involved in driving, however complicated, don't involve consciousness. I believe this approach to consciousness will take us a long way towards answering the riddle of what consciousness buys you and why it evolved. My own philosophical position about consciousness accords with the view proposed by the first Reith lecturer, Bertrand Russell. There is no separate mind stuff and physical stuff in the universe. The two are one and the same. The formal term for this is neutral monism. So we've talked about the messages in the new visual pathway. But now let's turn to the other pathway, the old pathway, which goes to the colliculus, mediates blind sight. That projects to the parietal lobes on the sides of the brain. The parietal lobes are concerned with creating a three-dimensional representation, a symbolic representation, of the spatial layout of the external world. So the ability that we call spatial navigation, avoiding bumping into things, dodging a missile that's hurled at you, catching something that's thrown at you, all of these abilities depend crucially on the parietal lobes. Now, when the right parietal lobe is damaged, you get a fascinating syndrome called neglect. In a sense, the converse of blind sight. The patient can no longer move his eyes towards the object, which is looming towards him, and he can no longer reach out and point to it or grab it. Now, bear in mind, he isn't blind to events on the left side of the world, because if you draw his attention, he can see it perfectly clearly, and he'll identify it. He'll tell you what it is. So he's not blind. So you can think of neglect. I think the best description of it is, it's an indifference to the left side of the world. That's why you call it neglect. If he's eating from a plate of food, he'll eat only from the right side of the plate and completely leave the left side of the plate uneaten. Then you draw his attention, he'll say, oh my God, that's a nice avocado, and he'll take it. So when you draw his attention, he can see it, but otherwise he ignores it. If he's shaving, he'll only shave from the right side of his face. Or if she's a woman, only apply makeup on the right side of the face. And that looks quite bizarre, as you can imagine. Now, as I said, neglect is caused by damage to the right hemisphere. The patient is also usually paralyzed on the left side, because the right hemisphere of the brain controls the left side of the body, I wondered, would it be possible to cure neglect? Can you treat this patient, making him pay attention to the left side of the world he's ignoring? So I hit on the idea of using a mirror, as in the case of phantom limbs in my previous lecture. So all I did was I had the patient sitting on a chair, and then I stood to the right side of the patient and held a mirror like that, so that when the patient rotated his head to the right, he would be looking directly into the mirror that I was holding on his right side. Now the question is, how does he react to this? Obviously, he's not neglecting the right side. He's only neglecting the left side of the world, so clearly he can see the mirror. But he's going to see the reflection of the left side of the world inside the mirror. The question is, how is he going to react to that? Well, one possibility is he's going to say, hey, my God, that's a reflection. There's a whole left side of the world that I've been ignoring. Let me pay attention. And turn around and pay attention. In which case you have cured neglect instantly with a mirror. Or he could say, well, look, the reflection is on my right side, so the objects are on my left, but hey, left doesn't exist in my universe. I'm supposed to neglect it, so I'll just ignore it. So he ignores the reflection. What happens? Well, what happened actually, as often happens in science, was neither. Okay? I stood on her right, so she's sitting here in the wheelchair. I was standing on her right side, holding up a mirror. She looked inside the mirror. And on her left side was my student, standing with a pen, holding a pen. And I asked the patient, what do you see? What am I holding? The patient says, oh, you're holding a mirror. I said, how do you know? He said, well, I can see my reflection in it, and it's cracked on the top, which is true. And I said, what do you see in the mirror? He said, oh, I see your student, John. He's holding a pen. I said, okay, I would now like you to use your right hand, remember her right hand is not paralyzed, to reach out, grab the pen, and then write your name on the pad that's on your lap. Now, of course, you try this on a normal person, and actually I have tried it on a normal colleague. You just reach, you see the reflection in the mirror of the person holding the pen, you turn to the left, grab the pen, and write your name on the pad. What did the patient do? It was absolutely astonishing. The patient looks in the mirror, reaches out into the mirror for the reflection. Bang, bang, bang. Starts clawing the surface of the mirror. Or on some occasions, reaches behind the mirror, trying to grab the reflection, sometimes yanking my tie, grabbing my belt buckle. Remember, I was holding the mirror on the patient's right side. And I said, what are you doing, Mrs. D? The patient's name. The patient said, oh, I'm reaching for the pen. I said, no, I don't mean the reflection. I mean the real pen. Where is the real pen? The patient says, the real pen is inside the mirror, doctor. Or on another occasion, the pen is behind the darn mirror, doctor. Okay? Now, this is absolutely astonishing because we have tried this on a 3-year-old child. So the child is sitting here on a chair. You hold the mirror on the right side of the child, and you have an assistant on the other side holding a candy, and you tell the child, reach and grab the candy. The child realizes there's some kind of game, giggles, and reaches correctly for the candy on the left side and takes it. Even a chimpanzee can do this, doesn't confuse a mirror image for a real object. But the older and wiser Mrs. D, 70 years of experience with mirrors, reaches straight into the mirror. Bang, bang, bang. Why does this happen? We call it mirror agnosia or looking glass syndrome in honor of Alice, who actually walked into the mirror thinking it was a real world. Why does it happen? Well, I think what happens is this patient's brain is saying, speaking metaphorically, look, that's a mirror. I know it's a mirror. That's a reflection. Therefore, the object is on my left. But left doesn't exist in my universe. Therefore, the object must be inside the mirror, however absurd it seems to all of you chaps. And therefore, I'll reach into the mirror. Bang, bang, bang. All of that abstract knowledge about the laws of optics and mirrors is now distorted to accommodate the strange new sensory world that the patient finds herself trapped in. Now, I'll turn to another disorder, which is also caused by damage to the right parietal, and that is even more extraordinary. It's called denial or anosognosia. Remember, most of these patients with right parietal damage also have some damage to the internal capsule, so they're completely paralyzed in the left side of the body. It's what you mean by a stroke. this complete paralysis of the left side of the body. And most of them complain about this, as indeed they should. They're saying, when am I going to get better? My arm doesn't work. But a subset of them, a small percentage of them, will vehemently deny that their left arm is paralyzed. And these are patients who don't have any neglect. They'll say, doctor, it's moving fine. Why does this happen? It's not clear, but it's only seen when the right parietal is damaged, rarely seen when the left parietal is damaged, and that gives you a clue. It tells you that the denial syndrome has something to do with hemispheric specialization, the manner in which the two cerebral hemispheres deal with the external world, especially the manner in which they deal with discrepancies in sensory input and discrepancies in beliefs. Specifically, I'd like to suggest, when confronted with a discrepancy, the left hemisphere's coping style is to smooth over the discrepancy, pretend it doesn't exist, and forge ahead. The right hemisphere's coping style is the exact opposite. It's highly sensitive to discrepancies, so I call it the anomaly detector. Now imagine a patient with a right hemisphere stroke, left side paralyzed. The patient is sending a command to move the arm. He's getting a visual signal saying it's not moving, so there's a discrepancy. His right hemisphere is damaged. His left hemisphere goes about its job of denial and confabulation, smoothing over the discrepancy and saying, oh, all is fine, don't worry. On the other hand, if the left hemisphere is damaged and the right side is paralyzed, the right hemisphere is functioning fine, notices the discrepancy between the motor command and the lack of visual feedback and says, my God, you're paralyzed. This was an outlandish idea, but it's now been tested with brain imaging experiments and shown to be essentially correct. Now, this syndrome is quite bizarre, a person denying that he or she is paralyzed. But what we found about 7 or 8 years ago, something even more amazing. Some of these patients will deny that another patient is paralyzed. So if the patient is sitting here, we show the patient another patient sitting in a wheelchair. I'll call him patient B. And I tell patient B, move your arm. Patient B, of course, is paralyzed, doesn't move. And then I ask my patient, is that patient moving his arm? And the patient says, yes, of course he's moving his arm. He's engaging in denial of other people's disabilities. Now, at first, this didn't make any sense to me. Then I came across some studies by Giacomo Rizzolatti, experiments done on monkeys. If you record from parts of the frontal lobes which are concerned with motor commands, you find there are cells which fire when the monkey performs certain specific movements. Like one cell will fire when the monkey reaches out and grabs a peanut. Another cell will fire when the monkey pulls something. Yet another cell when the monkey pushes something. Now that's well known. These are motor command neurons. But Rizzolatti found that some of these neurons will also fire when the monkey watches another monkey performing the same action. So you find a peanut grabbing neuron, which fires when the monkey grabs a peanut. When the monkey watches another monkey grab a peanut, it fires. It's quite extraordinary because the visual image of somebody else grabbing the peanut is utterly different. So you have to do this internal mental transformation to do that computation and for that neuron to fire. And Rizzolatti calls these mirror neurons. Another name for them is monkey see, monkey do neurons. And these neurons, I think, are the ones that are damaged in these patients. Because think about what's involved in your judging somebody else's movements. Maybe you need to do a virtual reality internal simulation of what that person is doing. And that may involve the activity of these very same neurons, these mirror neurons. So these mirror neurons, instead of being some kind of curiosity, hold important implications for understanding many aspects of human nature, like how do you read somebody else's movements, their intentions, their actions, many aspects of what you call a theory of other minds, a sophisticated theory of other people's behavior. We think it's this system of neurons that's damaged in these patients. The patient can therefore no longer construct an internal model of somebody else's actions. I also want to argue that these neurons may have played an important role in human evolution, and I'm going to talk about this at length in my Oxford lecture on the emergence of language and abstract thinking, because think about it. One of the hallmarks of our species is what we call culture. And culture depends crucially on imitation of your parents, of your teachers, and the imitation of complex skills may require the participation of mirror neurons. So what I'm arguing is somewhere around 50,000 years ago, maybe the mirror neuron system became sufficiently sophisticated that there was an explosive evolution of this ability to mime complex actions, in turn leading to cultural transmission of information, which is what characterizes us humans. Now, let me conclude by emphasizing once again that although the studies on patients are intriguing in themselves, our real agenda here is to understand, in terms of brain function, us normal humans, how our brains work. The whole spectrum of abilities that we call human nature, whether it's body image or culture or language or abstract thinking. And I hope to convince you that such a deeper understanding of the brain will have a profound impact not just on the sciences, but on the humanities as well. Lofty questions about the mind are fascinating to ask. Philosophers have been asking them for 3 millennia, both in India, where I'm from, and here in the West, but it is only in the brain that we can eventually hope to find the answers. Thank you very much.
Professor Ramachandran, thank you very much indeed. So many questions thrown up here. If you can find one zombie in your head at work, how many other zombies are there in there? And if, as Descartes argued, I think, therefore I am, who or what precisely is doing the thinking? Let me open the debate to our audience here in Edinburgh. Can I have a question, please? Gentleman here.
Thanks very much. I'm Adam Zeman, a neurologist based here. I wondered if you could say a little more about the capacities of unconscious processes, because clearly they can do quite a lot for us. They can enable someone with blind sight to point to a target which he can't see. They tell me the name which I thought I'd forgotten 10 minutes later. They sometimes deliver the solutions of scientific problems to scientists in their dreams. What are the capacities of unconscious processes? What are the scope and limits?
This is a very important question, and it's not been studied in detail, even in blind sight patients. What are the limits of their abilities? It's claimed, for example, Cowie has shown that some aspects of wavelength discrimination can be done with just using blind sight without your being consciously aware of it. But can you recognize facial expressions? I don't know the answer to that. So it's an empirical question. How much can the unconscious pathway do? And it's a very important question because remember I told you about these 2 lists. One, what are the things you can do consciously? What are the things you do unconsciously? What parts of the brain are involved? In compiling those lists, that question you asked is going to turn out to be very important.
I know that we have someone who is blind on the front row here. I don't know whether would you like to ask a question? Does any of this ring a bell with you at all?
It's Jackie Smith. I wondered whether stimulating the memory of colour is required to retain the long-term memory of it, really, so you can retain it. Like I had my sight, so do I need to keep stimulating those memories?
How long ago did you have your sight?
It was 99 I was registered blind.
Right. But you feel you can remember colour?
I can remember colour, and I very much want to hold on to that memory, because obviously I can't see it. But I wondered if you have to keep stimulating it, or whether it's a stored memory.
One of the things we know now is when you imagine a colour, or indeed imagine a shape, or imagine any object, to some extent there's partial activation of the same visual pathways that are involved when you actually look at something. So normally we think of it as a one-way flow of information. But now the wealth of evidence suggests that, in fact, there's back and forth. I mean, information goes back from memory and higher stages of brain processing back to visual cortex, maybe even to the lateral geniculate, as there are messages going from the retina towards higher centers in the brain. So the short answer is, intuitively, I would say that rehearsing these memories, these colors, certainly could be something very enriching.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Kemp. I'm a student of sociology and evolutionary biology. Just to return quickly to the blind sight, I was wondering if those with no damage to their brain and fine sight, if you had ever purposely obstructed their sight and seen if they could touch a light or something away from them that they couldn't actually see, if they could tap into the alternate pathway.
If you completely obstruct sight and give them a spot of light, there is no way other than supernatural, ESP or something like that, they could touch it. But if there is something or entity there, they could start using auditory localization and other sensory pathways more effectively. That's known. In fact, people who are blind from birth or from very early childhood, we know that auditory input now expands into the vacated visual regions, which are hungry for sensory input. So they have now bigger regions of the brain devoted to hearing. And this has been shown by both imaging experiments and psychophysics, and by transcranial magnetic stimulation. So this shows that the sort of pop psychology view that if you're blind, then your other senses become more vivid. There's a lot of truth to that, and there's an actual neural mechanism that mediates it, which you can study. But if you just take any normal adult and blindfold and you show a spot, there's no way he can touch it. I mean, that's ESP. That's in X-Files.
Gentleman here.
Andrew Whiten, University of St Andrews. I should think many people will be fascinated by your case of Mrs. D scrabbling at the mirror there for the pen, which is actually on her left. And I mean, it seems to me that what's so important about that is it challenges our almost complacency that, we're the rational, intelligent species, and our rationality is somehow global. It'll solve any problem out there. This seems to just beautifully illustrate, no, that's not the case. What's going on there?
First of all, I want to make it clear that if you put the mirror in front of Mrs. D or Mrs. B, whatever, these are all pseudonyms anyway, you put the mirror in front of her, and then you show a pen above her shoulder on the right side, so she can't see it, but she can see the reflection in the mirror. Then she can reach behind her, grab the pen fine. So this shows it's not because she doesn't know what a mirror is. It's not because she has a problem with coordination. But when you put the mirror on the right side, she flips into the twilight zone and says, oh my God, let me reach into the mirror. Now, with regard to your point about consistency, how is it that here's a rational human being who's intelligent, bang, bang, bang into the mirror, holding this absurd belief that there is an object residing inside the mirror or behind the mirror, in fact, actually telling you that? Well, let me say, this is very surprising at first, but we all do it. We just don't realize it. Most of you here are in denial. To give you a simple example, somebody recently did a survey asking people, are you above average in intelligence or below average in intelligence? 98% of people say they're above average. Now, this is mathematically impossible, and it shows that half of mankind is in denial about their stupidity. Okay? So, and likewise, I know many eminent theoretical physicists and scientists who, and I don't want to offend anybody's religious sensibilities, but who believe there's an old man there, looking after you and answering your prayers. So you can hold, even otherwise completely rational people, hold inconsistent beliefs, and what you're seeing in these patients is a floridly amplified form of this, which allows you to study these phenomena in great detail.
Do you buy that, Professor?
Well, I wanted to come back on the idea that we in our sort of everyday lives are, say, just like one of the blind sight patients. Because when you were describing them, you were talking about two completely different neural pathways, that one was able to be used when the other couldn't be. To take your example of driving then, are you really suggesting that when we're driving along and everything's automatic, that's happening in one part of the brain, and then suddenly we notice something and the computations suddenly leap to the other part of the brain, and that's then conscious? Is that what you're saying? Are we just like them in that respect?
Yeah, the answer to that is that in the case of a normal person, it's not compulsory. In other words, I can switch to paying attention to the driving if I want to, even though primarily I'm paying attention to the conversation. And mostly it's done by blind sight, the driving. But I can switch to seeing it consciously. In the blind sight patient, that's not the case. He's only conscious of the conversation or whatever, and he cannot pay attention to what's going on.
My name's Mary Jane, and I'm researching parapsychology. Do you think that there are many levels of consciousness, as opposed to just being conscious and unconscious, and that the lower levels are more physical?
Obviously, there are many different levels of consciousness. There are many levels of unconsciousness or coma, depending on whether your pupil constricts or doesn't constrict, and so on, whether you have a reflex or don't have a reflex, and so on and so forth. By the way, I don't believe in parapsychology, so I'm not talking about that. I'm not ruling it out. I'm just saying that my gut feeling is that it's not. There's nothing there. But so clearly there are different levels of consciousness, but I think that that's the wrong way to go if you want to understand consciousness. It kind of actually can mislead you. It's better to forge ahead and say, look, there is a phenomenon here which is fascinating. Some pathways are connected with consciousness, other pathways are not. Why? What are the characteristics? And then later you can get to borderline cases saying, what about when you're half conscious? What about when you're sleepwalking? Is a Venus flytrap conscious when you touch it with an insect and it snaps shut? So these borderline cases actually distract you from the main agenda, which is understanding what is the key distinction, why did consciousness evolve? But it's a good question, nevertheless.
At the risk of oversimplifying, can I just ask something which I think sounds terribly simple, probably isn't, which is that can we presume, therefore, that consciousness is a construct of the brain?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we now believe, obviously, his heart is not conscious, contrary to what Aristotle thought, or the liver is not conscious, but we know it's in the brain. So now you can home in further and say there are certain circuits that are conscious. What are they doing? What's special? I don't think there's a grand climactic solution to the problem of consciousness, saying, here it is, an elegant solution. It's not going to be like DNA, where you say the double helical structure dictates the logic of heredity, and now we understand life. But I think you're going to have many components to this problem of consciousness. What is self-awareness? What is abstract thinking? What is free, quote-unquote, free will? And so it's like the many different processes of life, the Krebs cycle, the genetic code, what's RNA doing? So now people don't go around asking, but what is life? You know about the Krebs cycle, you know about the genetic code, but you still don't know what is life. And I think the same is going to be true for consciousness.
Hi, my name's Kate Atkinson, and I'm a writer, so this is a deeply unscientific question, unlike all the others. It's poor on Mrs. D again. What does Mrs. D see when she dreams?
That's a very good question. I didn't ask her, but we have occasionally seen a patient having a terrifying dream that she was paralyzed. The patient who's ordinarily denying that she is paralyzed and saying, oh, I'm fine, wakes up in a dream terrified that she's paralyzed, which of course she is. So it's as though in your dream, you're willing to confront unpleasant aspects of your reality, of what's going on. So, shades of Freud that I hesitate to say. Yeah.
My name's Jim Herford. I'm a linguist at Edinburgh. You've been talking about consciousness, and people often talk about self-consciousness. Now, you've been talking as if there's a subject of consciousness in the brain, and what one is conscious of is some object of consciousness elsewhere. And it would seem that your analogy of the little chap looking at the screen would rule out the possibility of self-consciousness. Do you agree with that?
Well, one of the things I think about self-consciousness is usually people think that the reason you develop self-consciousness in introspection is to allow you to model the behavior of other people. If you know what it is to feel anguish, you can better judge somebody else's anguish. I think it's the other way around, personally. I think what happened was your brain developed the capacity to model other people's behavior in a very sophisticated manner, using, for example, the mirror neuron system. Then you apply that same algorithm to your own body. So you see yourself as a person in that representation you've created. And that is the origin of self-awareness. But there's a great deal of more work to be done before we can, give you a specific answer to that question.
Gentleman
there. Yeah, hi, Neil. I'm a psychologist at Edinburgh University. Free will, do you believe that as a conscious process or the unconscious guiding the conscious?
See, I'm a scientist who, very pragmatic. I want an experimental foothold onto something. To give you an example of free will, how do you study this? Take somebody and tell him or her, in the next 10 minutes, wiggle your finger whenever you feel like it 3 times. Just do it 3 times, but whenever you feel like it, using your free will. They can do it all in the first 1 minute, or wait till the 9th minute or 10th minute, and the person uses his free will and wiggles his finger. Now you measure his brain potentials. The amazing thing is, almost 3/4 of a second prior to his feeling that he's willed the movement of the finger, there's a brain potential you can detect, and you can predict he's going to move his finger. This is well known, and it created a big controversy among philosophers. Doesn't this negate free will? We're doing a little twist to this experiment, taking the signal and displaying it on a screen in front of you. So now I tell you, whenever you feel like it, wiggle your finger. And guess what happens? A second before you wiggle it, the machine's telling you, wiggle your finger. So what are you going to feel? Are you going to say, my God, I'm a zombie? This machine is predicting every time when I'm going to wiggle my finger. There is no free will. Or are you going to confabulate like Mrs. D and say, oh no, the machine told me after I willed it. In other words, you actually negate the truth to preserve your sense of freedom and being in charge of your destiny and your actions. So this, as a scientist, for me, gives an experimental handle on this problem.
I'm going to exercise my free will, dictated by my producer, and call an end to this for tonight. Thank you very much indeed. Next week we'll be in Birmingham, in the Patrick Centre at the Birmingham Hippodrome, for the third of the lectures, where we'll be focusing on why man creates and appreciates art, and why, despite the pleasure it may give, we don't perceive a page 3 girl as a work of art. That's The Artful Mind, next week. Thank you now to our audience here in Edinburgh, and thank you to our Reith lecturer, Professor Villanor Ramachandran, and good night. Good evening. Tonight, science crosses into art. No cultural divisions here. We've come to the Patrick Centre for the Performing Arts in Birmingham to talk about the Artful Brain. That's the title of the third in this year's series of Reith lectures, given by one of the world's leading neuroscientists, Villanor Ramachandran. If you followed his first 2 lectures, you'll be familiar with some of the extraordinary workings of the brain. Why, for example, people who've lost an arm or a leg can still feel pain in a phantom limb, or how occasionally someone who's visually blind can see via a different route to the brain, the phenomenon of blind sight, as it's called. Research into these unusual conditions and others is currently leading to a greater understanding of how the normal human brain works. But can such investigative techniques be applied to our appreciation of art? What happens when we hear a Mozart symphony or a Shakespearean sonnet, or admire a painting by Titian or Lucian Freud? What forms and informs our sense and sensibility of what we're seeing and hearing? Our audience here in Birmingham includes art historians, musicians, novelists, painters, as well as scientists, and later on they'll have the chance to respond to what they hear this evening from our Reith lecturer, 2003, the director of the Centre for Brain and Cognition at the University of California, San Diego, Professor Villanor Ramachandran.
Thank you very much. In this lecture, which is the most speculative one in the series of 5, I'd like to take up one of the most ancient questions in philosophy, psychology, and anthropology, namely, what is art? When Picasso said, art is the lie that reveals the truth, what exactly did he mean? As we saw in my previous lectures, neuroscientists have made some headway in understanding the neural basis of psychological phenomena like body image, how you construct your body image, or visual perception. But can the same be said of art, given that art obviously originates in the brain? In particular, what I'd like to do is to raise the question, are there such things as artistic universals? Now, let me add a note of caution before I begin. When I speak of artistic universals, I'm not denying the enormous role played by culture. Obviously, culture plays a tremendous role, otherwise you wouldn't have different artistic styles. But it doesn't follow that art is completely idiosyncratic and arbitrary either, or that there are no universal laws. Let me put it somewhat differently. Let's assume that 90% of the variance you see in art is driven by cultural diversity, or more cynically, by just the auctioneer's hammer, and only 10% by universal laws that are common to all brains. The culturally driven 90% is what most people already study. It's called art history. As a scientist, what I'm interested in is the 10% that is universal, not in the endless variations imposed by cultures. The advantage that I and other scientists have today is that we can now test our conjectures by directly studying the brain empirically. There's even a new name for this discipline. My colleague Semir Zeki calls it neuroaesthetics, just to annoy the philosophers. I recently started reading about the history of ideas in art, especially Victorian reactions to Indian art, and it makes fascinating reading. For example, if you go to southern India, you look at the famous Chola bronze of the goddess Parvati, dating back to the 12th century. For Indian eyes, she's supposed to represent the very epitome of feminine sensuality grace, poise, dignity, everything that's good about being a woman. And she's, of course, also very voluptuous. But the Victorian Englishmen who first encountered these sculptures were appalled by Parvati, partly because they were prudish, but partly also just because of plain ignorance. They complained that the breasts were too big, the hips were too big, and the waist was too narrow. It didn't look anything like a real woman. It wasn't realistic. It was primitive art. And they said the same thing about the voluptuous nymphs of Khajuraho. Even about Rajasthani and Mughal miniature paintings. They said, look, these paintings don't have perspective. They're all distorted. They were judging Indian art using the standards of Western art, especially classical Greek art and Renaissance art, where realism is strongly emphasized. But obviously this is a fallacy. Anyone here today will tell you art has nothing to do with realism. It's not about creating a realistic replica of what's out there in the world. I mean, I can take a $5 camera, aim it at one of you here, take a photograph. It's very realistic, but you wouldn't give me a penny for it. In fact, art is the exact opposite. It's about deliberate hyperbole, exaggeration, in fact, even distortion, in order to create pleasing effects in the brain. Now, obviously, that can't be the whole story. You can't just take an image and randomly distort it and call it art, although many people in La Jolla, where I come from, do precisely that. The distortion has to be lawful. The question then becomes, what kinds of distortion are effective? What are the laws? So one day I was sitting in a temple in India when I was on a sabbatical, and in a whimsical frame of mind, I just jotted down what I think of as the universal laws of art, the 10 laws of art, which cut across cultural boundaries. Given our time limits, I'm going to just tell you about 5 of my 10 laws. The rest of them are on the BBC website, so you can go look it up. The first law I call peak shift, and to illustrate this, I'll use an example from hypothetical example from animal behavior, from rat psychology. Imagine you're training a rat to discriminate a square from a rectangle. So every time it sees a particular rectangle, you give it a piece of cheese. When it sees a square, you don't give it anything. Very soon it learns that the rectangle means food. It starts liking the rectangle, although you're not supposed to say that if you're a behaviorist. And it starts going towards the rectangle because it prefers the rectangle to the square. But now the amazing thing is, if you take a longer, skinnier rectangle and show it to the rat, it actually prefers the longer, skinnier rectangle to the original rectangle that you taught it. And you say, well, that's kind of stupid. Why does it prefer a longer, skinnier rectangle rather than the one you originally showed it? Well, it's not stupid at all, because what the rat is learning is a rule, rectangularity. And of course, therefore, if you make it longer and skinnier, it's even more rectangular. So it says, wow, what a rectangle. And it goes towards that rectangle. Now you say, well, what's that got to do with art? Well, let's think about caricature. What do you do in a caricature? Supposing you want to produce a caricature of Maggie Thatcher or a caricature of Nixon, what do? You take Nixon's face and you say, what's special about his face? What makes him different from other people? So what you do is you take the mathematical average of all male faces and you subtract it from Nixon's face, and you get the big bulbous nose and the shaggy eyebrows, and then you amplify it. And then you get an image that looks even more like Nixon than Nixon himself. Now, if you do it just right, you get great portraiture, you get a Rembrandt. But if you overdo it, then you get caricature. It looks comical. But it still looks even more like Nixon than the original Nixon. So you're behaving exactly like that rat. But what's it got to do with the rest of art? Let's go back to the Chola bronze of Parvati. Let's talk about Indian art. Well, the same principle applies. How does the artist convey the very epitome of feminine sensuality? What it does is simply take the female form, the average female form, subtract the average male form, you're going to get big breasts, big hips, and a narrow waist, and then amplify it. Amplify the difference. And you don't say, my God, it's anatomically incorrect. You say, wow, what a sexy goddess. But that's not all there is to it, because how do you bring in dignity, poise, grace? Well, what you do is something quite clever. What the Chola bronze artist does is something quite clever. There are some postures that are forbidden to a male. I can't stand like that even if I want to. But a woman can do it effortlessly. So what he does is he goes into an abstract space I call posture space, and then subtracts the male posture, the average male, from the female, and then exaggerates the feminine posture, and then you get this elegant triple flexion or tribhanga pose, where the head is tilted one way, the body is tilted the exact opposite way, and the hips again the other way. And again, you don't say, my God, that's anatomically inappropriate. Nobody can stand like that. You say, my God, it's gorgeous, it's beautiful. It's a celestial goddess. So this is the image is extremely evocative, and it's an example of the peak shift principle in Indian art. Okay, this is all about faces and caricatures and bodies and chola bronzes. That seems quite reasonable, but what about the rest of art? What about abstract art? What about Picasso? What about semi-abstract art? What about Impressionism? What about Cubism, Van Gogh, Monet, Henry Moore? How can these ideas even begin to approach some of those artistic styles? Now, to answer this question, you need to go and look at ethology, especially the work of Nico Tinbergen at Oxford more than 50 years ago. And he was doing some very elegant experiments on seagull chicks. Now, as soon as the herring gull chick hatches, it looks at its mother. The mother has a long beak with a red spot on it, yellow beak with a red spot. And the chick starts pecking at the red spot, begging for food. The mother then regurgitates half-digested food into the chick's gaping mouth. The chick swallows the food and is happy. Then Tinbergen asked himself, how does the chick know as soon as it's hatched whose mother? Why doesn't it beg for food from a person who's passing by or a pig? And he found that you don't need a mother. You can take a dead seagull, pluck its beak away, and wave the disembodied beak in front of the chick, and the chick will beg just as much for food, pecking at this disembodied beak. And you say, well, that's kind of stupid. What does the chick confuse the scientist waving a beak for a mother seagull? Well, the answer again is it's not stupid at all. Actually, if you think about it, the goal of vision is to do as little processing or computation that you need to do for the job on hand. In this case, for recognizing mother. And through millions of years of evolution, the chick has acquired the wisdom that the only time it'll see this long thing with a red spot is when there's a mother attached to it. After all, it's never going to see in nature a mutant pig with a beak or a malicious ethologist waving a beak in front of it. So it can take advantage of the statistical redundancy in nature and say, a long thing, yellow thing with a red spot is mother. Let me forget about everything else. And I'll simplify the processing and save a lot of computational labor by just looking for that. That's fine. But what Tinbergen found next is that you don't need even a beak. He took a long stick, yellow stick with three red stripes, which doesn't look anything like a beak. And that's important. And he waved it in front of the chick, and the chicks go berserk. They actually peck at this long thing with the three red stripes more than they would for a real beak. They prefer it to a real beak, even though it doesn't resemble a beak. It's as though he has stumbled on a super beak, or what I call an ultra beak. Now, why does this happen? We don't know exactly why, but obviously there are neural circuits in the visual pathways of the chick's brain that are specialized for detecting beaks as soon as the chick hatches. They fire when seeing the beak. Perhaps because of the way they are wired up, they may actually respond more powerfully to the stick with the three stripes than to a real beak. Maybe the neuron's receptive field embodies a rule such as the more red contour, the better. And it's more effective in driving the neuron, even though the stick doesn't look like a beak to you and me, or maybe even to the chick. And a message from this beak-detecting neuron now goes to the emotional limbic centers in the chick's brain, giving it a big jolt and saying, wow, what a super beak. And the chick is absolutely mesmerized. Well, now, what's this got to do with art, you're wondering? Well, this brings me to my punchline about art. What I'm suggesting is, if the seagulls had an art gallery, they would hang this long stick with the three red stripes on the wall. They would worship it, pay millions of dollars for it, call it a Picasso, but not understand why. Now, why am I mesmerized by this damn thing, even though it doesn't resemble anything? That's what all of you are doing when you're buying contemporary art. You're behaving exactly like those gull chicks. In other words, human artists, through trial and error, through intuition, through genius, have discovered the figural primitives of your perceptual grammar. They're tapping into these and creating for your brain the equivalent of the long stick with the three red stripes for the chick's brain. And what you end up with is a Henry Moore or a Picasso. Now, the advantage with these ideas, you can test them experimentally. You can actually record from cells in the brain which sort of fire when you show it a face in the fusiform gyrus. Now, some of them will fire only to a particular view of a face, But higher up, you've got neurons which respond to any view of a given face. And I'm predicting that if you present a cubist portrait of a monkey face, where you present two views of a monkey's face in the same place, that cell will be hyperactivated, just as the long stick with the 3 red stripes hyperactivates the beak-detecting neurons in the chick's brain. This cubist portrait of a monkey face will hyperactivate this face-detecting neurons in the monkey brain, and the monkey says, wow, what a face. So what you have here is, in fact, a neural explanation for Picasso, for Cubism. I've told you about one law so far, peak shift, and the idea of ultra-normal stimuli. We've borrowed insights from ethology, neurophysiology, rat psychology to account for why people like non-realistic art. The second law is much more familiar to all of you. It's called grouping. Many of you may have seen those famous puzzle pictures like the Richard Gregory's Dalmatian dog. You just see a bunch of splotches when you first look at it. But then you sense your visual brain trying to solve a perceptual problem, trying to make sense of this chaos. And then after a few seconds, or maybe actually several seconds, 30 or 40 seconds, suddenly everything clicks in place and you group all the correct fragments together, and lo and behold, you see a Dalmatian dog. You can almost sense your brain groping for a solution to the perceptual riddle. And as soon as you successfully group the correct fragments together to see the dog, what I suggest is a message gets sent from the visual centers in the brain to the limbic emotional centers in the brain, giving it a jolt and saying, aha, there is a dog, or aha, there is a face. The Dalmatian dog example is very important because it reminds us that vision is an extraordinarily complex and sophisticated process. And even looking at a simple visual scene involves a complex hierarchy, a stage-by-stage processing. At each stage in the hierarchy of processing, when a partial solution is achieved, hey, it looks a bit dog-like right here. There is a reward signal, aha, a partial aha. And a small bias is sent to earlier stages to facilitate the further binding of the features of the dog. And through such progressive bootstrapping, the final dog clicks in place to create the final big aha. Vision has much more in common with problem solving, more like a 20 questions game than we usually realize. The grouping principle is widely used in both Indian art and Western art, and even in fashion design. For example, you go to Harrods and you pick a scarf with red splotches on it. Then you often match it with a skirt which has got some red splotches on it. Now, what's this all about? Is it just hype? Is it just marketing? Or is it telling you something very deep about how the brain is organized? I'm going to argue it's telling you something very deep, something to do with the way the brain evolved. Vision evolved mainly to discover objects and to defeat camouflage. We don't realize this when you look around you and you see clearly defined objects. But imagine your primate ancestors scurrying up in the treetops, trying to detect a lion seen behind fluttering green foliage. What do you get inside the eyeball of the retina? It's just a bunch of yellow lion fragments, obscured by all the leaves. But the brain says, so to speak, what's the likelihood that all these different yellow fragments are exactly the same yellow simply by chance? 0. They must all belong to one object. So let me link them together, glue them together. Oh my God, it's a lion, let me get out of here. And as soon as you glue them together, a signal gets sent to the limbic system saying, aha, there's something object-like, pay attention here. So there's an arousal and an attention, which then titillates the limbic system, and you pay attention and you dodge the lion. And such ahas are created, I maintain, at every stage in the visual hierarchy as object-like entities, partial object-like entities are discovered that draw your interest and attention. What the artist tries to do is to generate as many of these aha signals in as many visual areas as possible by more optimally exciting these areas with his paintings or sculptures than you could achieve with natural visual scenes or realistic images. Not a bad definition of art if you think about it. Now that takes me to the next law, the third law, the law of perceptual problem solving or visual peekaboo. Now what do I mean by that? As anyone knows, a nude seen behind a diaphanous veil is much more alluring and tantalizing than a full-color Playboy photo or a Chippendale pinup or a page 3 girl. Is that what you call it? Page 3 girl. Why? As I said, our brains evolved in highly camouflaged environments. Imagine you're chasing your mate through dense fog. Then you want every stage in the process, every partial glimpse of her, to be pleasing enough to prompt further visual search, so you don't give up the search prematurely in frustration. In other words, the wiring of your visual centers to your emotional centers ensures the very act of searching for the solution is pleasing. Just as struggling with a jigsaw puzzle is pleasing long before the final aha. Once again, it's about generating as many ahas as possible in your brain. The fourth law is the law of isolation or understatement. You all know that a simple outline doodle by Picasso or a nude by Rodin or Klimt can be much more evocative than a full-color photo of a woman. Similarly, the cartoon-like outline drawings of bulls in the Lascaux caves are much more powerful and evocative of the animal than a National Geographic photograph of a bull. Hence the famous aphorism in art, less is more. But why should this be so? Isn't it the exact opposite of the first law? The idea of hyperbole, of trying to excite as many ahas as possible. A pin-up or a page 3 girl, after all, has much more information. It's going to excite many more areas in your brain, many more neurons. So why isn't it more beautiful? The way out of this paradox is to consider another visual phenomenon called attention. It's a well-known fact that you can't have two overlapping patterns of neural activity simultaneously. Even though you've got 100 billion nerve cells, you can't have two overlapping patterns. In other words, there is a bottleneck of attention. You can only allocate your attentional resources to one thing at a time. Well, when you look at a page 3 girl, the main information about her sinuous soft contours is conveyed by her outline. Her skin tone, hair color, after all, is no different from anybody sitting here. It's irrelevant to her beauty as a nude. So in the realistic photo, you have all this irrelevant information cluttering the picture and distracting your attention away from where it's critically needed, to her contours and outlines. By leaving all this out in a doodle or sketch, the artist is saving your brain a lot of trouble. And this is especially true if the artist has also added some peak shifts to the outline to create an ultra nude or a super nude. Well, what's the evidence for all this? Of course, you can test it by doing brain imaging experiments, comparing neural responses to outline sketches and caricatures versus full-color photos. But there's also very striking neurological evidence from children with autism. Some of these children have what's called the savant syndrome. Even though they're retarded in many respects, they have one preserved island of extraordinary talent. For example, a 7-year-old autistic child, Nadia, had exceptional artistic skills. She was quite retarded mentally, could barely talk, yet she could produce the most amazing drawings of horses and roosters and other animals. A horse drawn by Nadia would almost leap out at you from the canvas. Contrast this with the lifeless, two-dimensional, tadpole-like sketches drawn by most normal 8 or 9-year-olds, or even normal adults. So you have another paradox. How can this retarded child produce a drawing that is so incredibly beautiful? The answer, I maintain, is the principle of isolation. In Nadia, perhaps many or even most of her brain modules are damaged because of her autism, but there is a spared island of cortical tissue in the right parietal. So her brain spontaneously allocates all her attentional resources to the one module that's still functioning, her right parietal. Now, it turns out that the right parietal is a part of your brain that's concerned with your sense of artistic proportion. We know this because when it's damaged, in stroke, for example, in an adult, you lose your artistic sense. You produce drawings which are often excessively detailed, but lack the vital essence of the picture you're trying to depict. You lose your sense of artistic proportion. Conversely, since everything else is damaged in Nadia's brain, she allocates all her attention to this brain module. So she has a hyper-functioning art module in her brain, hence the beautiful renderings of horses and roosters. Another example, equally striking, Dr. Miller, University of California, has studied patients who start developing rapidly progressing dementia in middle age, a form of dementia called the frontotemporal dementia, affecting frontal lobes and temporal lobes, but sparing the parietal lobes. And guess what happens? These patients suddenly start producing the most amazingly beautiful paintings and drawings. Not all of them, but some of them. Even though they had never had any artistic talent before the onset of their dementia. Again, it's the isolation principle at work. With all the other modules in the brain not working, the patient develops a hyper-functioning right parietal. There are even reports from Alan Schneider in Australia that you can temporarily paralyze parts of the brain in normal volunteers. All of us less gifted people here. Imagine just zapping bits of your brain and unleashing hidden talents. If that happens, it'll truly be a brave new world. Now, we don't have time to talk about all my other laws in detail, but I'll just mention the last law on my list, and in many ways the most important, yet the most elusive, visual metaphor. You all know what a metaphor is in literature as when you say it's the East and Juliet is the sun. But you can do the same thing in visual art, both in Western art and in Indian art. For example, when you look at the Chola bronze of the dancing Shiva or Nataraja with multiple arms, you're not meant to take the multiple arms literally or call it a multi-armed monstrosity like the Victorian art critic Sir George Birdwood did. Funnily enough, he didn't think that angels sprouting wings were monstrosities. Although I can tell you as a medical man, you can have multiple arms, but wings on scapulae are anatomically impossible. The multiple arms are meant to symbolize multiple divine attributes of God. And the ring of fire that Nataraja dances in, indeed his dance itself, is a metaphor of the dance of the cosmos and of the cyclical nature of creation and destruction, an idea championed by the late Fred Hoyle. Most great works of art, be it Western or Indian, most of these great works of art are pregnant with metaphor and have many layers of meaning. Everyone knows that metaphors are important, yet we have no idea why. Why not just say Juliet is radiant and warm, instead of saying Juliet is the sun? What is the neural basis of metaphor? We don't know, but I'll have a stab at this question next week in my Oxford lecture on synesthesia. With that, I conclude my lecture on neuroaesthetics. Have we understood the neural basis of art? Of course not. We have barely scratched the surface. But I hope the laws of art I've discussed might give you some hints about the general form of a future theory of art. The solution to the problem of aesthetics, I believe, lies in a more thorough understanding of the connections between the 30 visual centers in your brain and the emotional limbic structures. Once we have achieved a clear understanding of these connections, we'll be closer to bridging the huge gulf that now separates C.P. Snow's two cultures, science on the one hand, and arts, philosophy, and humanities on the other. We could be at the dawning of a new age where specialization becomes old-fashioned and a new 21st century version of the Renaissance man is born. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Ramachandran, and volunteers for temporary brain paralysis can see Rama later. So there you have some of the universal laws of art according to Ramachandran. How do you react to that? Has Rama hit your limbic centre and scored an aha or a wow? Let's find out what he's evoked in our audience here in Birmingham and have our first questioner, please. Gentleman here.
Ken Arnold from the Wellcome Trust. What happens to your laws when you start thinking about literature and music and dance?
Let's take music. In Indian ragas, for example, there's a raga called Darbari Kannada where you have this extremely sad raga, which is really melancholy. And I think what you're doing there is taking the infant separation anxiety cry, which is quite melancholy, and then amplifying it, doing what I call a peak shift. So some of these principles cut across these modality boundaries. But let me say that with vision, we know all the intricate mechanisms. There are 30 areas. We know the detailed circuitry of these areas. We know a lot about how these areas might have evolved. We know the laws of perception. And you can start studying these laws of aesthetics visually. With hearing, us primates are not intuitively auditory creatures. We are highly visual creatures. And we know very little about the auditory regions of the brain, much less than we know about vision. So it's simply a better place to put your money on, visual aesthetics. But I think that some of these principles may indeed apply to other aspects of aesthetics.
Jan Atkinson. I'm Director of the Medical Research Council Visual Development Unit in University College London. In development, there's a puzzle, which is that newborns like schematic faces better than scrambled images of faces, but what they really like is bullseyes and spirals. And this seems to kind of contravene your idea of a shift peak, because I'm puzzled as to what the ecological value or the evolutionary value of something like a spiral might be, or a bullseye.
Well, no, on the contrary, what I would argue is that there are some neurons which are picking up those images, and the bullseye, for some reason, is hyperactivating those neurons. And indeed, it would be very interesting to do preferential looking experiments in children where you show a Picasso versus a normal face, and I wouldn't be surprised if it actually prefers the Picasso. Now, this raises another question. If I'm right about universal laws and principles, then why doesn't everybody like a Picasso? You know, there are these neurons firing away. Aha! Okay, so why doesn't everybody like a Picasso? Well, the answer is, you're not going to like this, but the answer is, everybody does, but most people are in denial about it. To put it differently, there may be a core-level visceral reaction based on the activity of these neurons that in fact is universal, but the brain is not one monolithic entity. There are so many layers kicking in. And it's possible, even though the core visceral reaction to the Picasso is, my God, what a face, another part of your brain, the left hemisphere, kicks in and says, she looks weird, don't tell her she's beautiful. And that kicks in and forbids you from, or censors your responses. And much of your ability to appreciate new forms of art consists not necessarily of developing new templates, so much as removing these layers of culture and these encrustations imposed on you by society. And then you start appreciating at a more gut level that style of art.
Well, I'll come back on you and we'll definitely do the experiment.
Okay.
Just pass that forward, because the gentleman in front of you who's been writing furiously throughout the lecture, I wasn't sure whether you were sketching a picture of Rama or what you were up to. But anyway, put your question if you have one, sir.
John Reith. There have been some experiments done recently, I think, in which a large number of female faces have been collapsed into a single average face. And apparently this average face is regarded as more attractive than any of the individual faces, which seems to be another contradiction on the peak shift principle.
First of all, I would say that averaging faces, if you average lots of faces, it looks more pretty than any one face. And partly, of course, if there's lots of distortion, somebody has a huge big wart or a huge big nose, you're averaging these out. And this explains why the regression to the mean looks aesthetically pleasing. But I would maintain that if you take that average face, and if it's a female face or a male face, and you heighten the maleness or the femaleness in some way, in some quirky way, so I would maintain the most beautiful male face or the most beautiful female face is not necessarily the average. I think they've just done the experiment wrong. I think you get a reasonably good-looking face, which is average, because you avoid all the blemishes. But to make it especially attractive and evocative and beautiful, you need to do something with it. And in fact, if you see the most beautiful actors and actresses, there is something a little bit more than just the average, good-looking guy or good-looking girl.
David Lodge, novelist and critic, mainly thought about this issue in relation to literature rather than art. You can produce some rules which allow you to identify literature. It doesn't mean that everything in that category is good, is valuable. It seems to me you have to do the same for art. That is, you have to give the criteria which will separate art from non-art. Yeah. But within the category of art, you could have all kinds of different evaluations.
Well, let me give you a partial answer to that. Let's take kitsch art. Kitsch art has a lot of these rules, grouping and maybe even peak shift and maybe this and that. But instantly, if you're a sophisticated, art critic or person who buys art in auctions, this is kitsch. Now, one view, cynical view, would be what's kitsch for one person is high art for another. It's completely arbitrary. Well, I don't agree. Because you all know you can mature from kitsch to genuine art, but you can't slide backwards once you have. So the question then becomes a challenge for me. Well, what's the difference? Kitsch art employs the same principles. So what's the difference between kitsch and the genuine article? I would answer that what happens in kitsch is that you go through the mannerisms of real art, superficially deploying these principles without really understanding them. And if you go and look at some kitsch works of art, that's what happens. But it doesn't quite grab you in the same way because you haven't done it properly. The same holds for literature or for music or any of those things.
Woman here.
I'm Sylvia King from Jubilee Arts in West Bromwich. I'm kind of very excited about what you've said, but also a little bit disturbed because I work with people who think art's not for them. We work with people from the Asian community, from the African Caribbean community, and from the white working class community. And actually, to me, I thought what you were indicating, maybe the future is that we could get rid of some of the barriers so that those diverse communities actually aren't discriminated against because of a lot of their norms and how they see it. And certainly those working class communities and what they like and see as valuable and aesthetically pleasing, and all those limbic bits in your brain get stimulated. Between that, popular culture, high art and all the rest, we might start seeing the spaces in between and find something quite interesting.
Well, obviously, a lot of art is also about snobbery, and it's used as a status symbol, and I have something unique. And those aspects, they're very important questions from a political, social point of view, but it's not something that I have tried to get into. But going back to Indians and Africans and other ethnic groups, I think that what I'm saying is perfectly, they should, if anything, encourage them to go back to their roots and say, I don't want to have a Eurocentric view of art. Art history, most of it is about Picasso and Van Gogh and Renaissance art. I should go back and look at our art, which is several thousand years old. And in fact, it's claimed that Picasso drew a lot of his inspiration from African art. So certainly you can go back and draw inspiration from it, and you should be encouraged rather than discouraged.
I'm Joe Holyoke. I'm an architect. Your 10% seems to be about a residue of atavism, if I understand it. Yep. If we believe in human development, can we assume that 10% is going to decrease as time goes on? Or conversely, in the past, was it 15% or 20%?
Yeah.
Is it fixed or is it dynamic?
Well, that's raising questions about the evolution of the human race and the future of our brains and things like that. What I would say is I agree with your point that it's, in a sense, an atavism, which is what I was saying about the gull chick and the three stripes and all of that. Closely related questions is, if it's universal, is it universal only among humans? What about animals? Do they have art? And you all know about elephants and chimpanzees producing works of abstract art, which are sometimes sold to prominent art critics as works of art. But let me mention bowerbirds. If you go to bowerbirds in New Guinea, they produce the most incredibly beautiful bowers. It's often 20, 30 times the size of the little nondescript-looking bachelor bird. And principles like grouping, they take all the berries that are red and put them together. And linearity, they have tidy rows of berries. They even bring in jewelry, like little bits of cigarette foil, and then group them together. And they have elaborate archways into their bowers. So these principles, some of these principles I'm talking about, like peak shift and grouping and things like that, I think cut across not just cultures, but across species barriers. I think you could take one of those bowerbirds' bowers and put them in a Madison Avenue art gallery, and if you don't tell people, somebody might buy it, paying a lot of money for it.
Nick Chater, University of Warwick. It seems to me that you've described aesthetics very much from the point of view of object recognition. But it seems a lot of appreciation of visual and other aesthetic experiences is not really concerned with recognition, but with pattern. And if we take the example of music, that seems particularly clear, that although perhaps one aspect of a particular raga may be viewed as similar to a cry of a mother, or maybe some particular pattern on a stick may be of interest to a seagull because it appears rather like the mother seagull, presumably that's just not the general case. There must be all kinds of very general aspects of perceptual organisation concerned with patterns, which also drive aesthetic instincts.
Believe it or not, much of perception, a lot of it has to do with segmenting the world into objects before you proceed to say, what is it, and categorize it and identify it and so on and so forth. So we don't realize this because, we live in a world that's where you can easily see objects, but up there in the treetops when you're evolving, recognition, delineating objects, finding out which pieces belong together to constitute one object, paying attention to that, and then reacting to it appropriately, evolutionarily, is an extremely important aspect of perception. In fact, that's what most of perception is about.
Do you want to come back on that quickly?
Can I make one other point?
Okay, cool.
I just thought of something. Going back to the point about objectness, you could say, well, let's take somebody like Monet or Van Gogh, where the emphasis is not on objectness, but on color. Well, guess what? What I'm calling peak shift or ultra-normal a long stick with the 3 stripes. That's about objects and about spatial vision. But you could play the same trick in other domains. For example, we know there are 30 areas in the brain. There are areas just concerned with color alone. They don't care about form or shape, especially in us primates. And what tends to happen is, in that map of the brain, you bring different regions of the visual image which have the same color together in one region of the map. In other words, it's an abstract map of color space, not literal space, but of color space in your brain. So you could produce peak shifts or caricatures or ultra-normal stimuli, not in the form or object domain, but in the color space or color domain. And then you get heightened water lily colors, heightened sunflower colors, which are absurdly exaggerated colors, deliberately under-emphasizing form or shape. And that harks back to the isolation principle I was talking about, to heighten your experience of the intense water lily color or the sunflower color. So what I'm saying is some works of art do tap into other things besides objects, such as color or sometimes movement, as in kinetic art.
It's your teacher, Professor Richard Gregory, on the front row, Rama.
Rama, do you think one could put your laws into a computer and have a computer at least draw cartoons, particularly with your peak shift idea?
Well, that's a good idea, and I think what's going to happen is that the better your understanding of the laws and the more you can specify them in a sequence of steps in the form of algorithms, and you can put them into a computer, you produce an image that's certainly more aesthetically pleasing than a random scribble. Now, whether it would be a great work of art, simply because you've deployed these laws, or simply kitsch, that's what is the tricky bit. How do you make it non-kitsch and real a work of genius? We haven't got there yet.
Do you think you can, Richard?
Well, I think you could test your laws in a way and show how much extra is needed. So it might be an interesting thing to try out.
Yeah,
maybe you could define kitsch by the computer's failure.
Yeah, that's right.
There you are, sir. Thank you.
Aaron Sloman, philosopher in the School of Computer Science, University of Birmingham. There's an artist called Harold Cohen who has produced a computer program which shares its first name with me, Aaron. And if you go to Google and type Harold Cohen Aaron, you can get a link to a version of this program where you can click and it'll paint you a picture, or you can buy it and have it. Its pictures are amazing. They really sell. I know people who have framed large versions of them on their walls, and how it does it, he doesn't really explain, except that it does it something like the way he would do it if he were painting them.
That's a good conclusion to
I think so. Thank you all very much indeed. Next week we're in one of our lecturers' old stamping grounds, which is Oxford, for the 4th of this year's Reith Lectures. The intriguing title is Purple Numbers and Sharp Cheese. Cross-references familiar to us all, but what is their provenance, and is it to do with the wiring, so-called, of the brain? That's the next milestone in our series, The Emerging Mind. From here in Birmingham this evening, my thanks to our audience and thanks to our Reith Lecturer 2003, Villanor Ramachandran, and good night. Good evening from the Nelson Mandela Lecture Theatre in Oxford, where an audience of scientists, artists and writers are waiting to hear the 4th Reith Lecture on the subject of the human mind. Our lecturer, a neuroscientist, is a man who's been a fan of Sherlock Holmes since he was a boy, and in fact sees his work on the human brain as that of a detective in part, presented with bizarre neurological cases, a man who believes his mother is an imposter, a clinically blind man who can see. He searches for the rational anatomical explanation. So you can see that Freudian theories are being challenged here. So far, we've learned that there are other ways of seeing than through the eye. We've been shown ways of cheating the brain by using mirrors. And last week, we were offered explanations as to why a Rodin sculpture or a Picasso sketch can generate pleasure in our soul. Did I say so? Here we have a man who deals with more tangible matter, the 1.5 kilos of jelly we call the brain. Tonight he confirms that people who hear shapes or see sounds aren't mad or bad, but in fact provide us with clues to the development of language and expression. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome this scientific sleuth, the director of the Center for Brain and Cognition at the University of California, Professor Vilanur Ramachandran.
In the 19th century, the Victorian scientist Francis Galton, who was a cousin of Charles Darwin, noticed something very peculiar. He found that certain people in the normal population, who were otherwise perfectly normal, had a certain peculiarity, and that is, every time they heard a specific tone, they would experience a specific color. For example, C sharp might be red, F sharp might be blue, another tone might be indigo. And this curious mingling of the senses was called synesthesia. Some of these people also see colors when they see numbers. Every time they see a black and white number, like the number 5 printed on a white page, or a white 5 on a black page for that matter, they would see it tinged red. So 5 might be red, 6 would be green, 7 would be indigo, 8 would be yellow, and so on and so forth. Galton also pointed out this condition runs in families, and more recently Simon Baron-Cohen in Cambridge has confirmed this, that there does indeed run in families. Now, I think it's fair to say that even though people have known about synesthesia for over 100 years, it's been by and large regarded as a curiosity by mainstream neuroscience and psychology. But what I'd like to do today, in fact, is suggest that anomalies can be extremely important in science. If you know which anomaly to pick, most of them are bogus, of course, but if you know which anomaly to pick, it can completely change the direction of your research and generate what Kuhn called scientific revolutions. But first, let's look at the most common explanations that have been proposed to account for synesthesia. And in fact, there are 4 of these. The first explanation is the most obvious, and that is they're just crazy. Now, the second explanation is maybe they're just acid junkies or potheads. Okay? They've just been on drugs. Now, this is not an entirely inappropriate criticism because synesthesia is more common among people who use LSD. But to me, that makes it more interesting, not less interesting. Why should some chemicals cause synesthesia, if indeed they do? The third idea is that maybe these people are just remembering childhood memories. For example, maybe they were playing with refrigerator magnets, and 5 was red, and 6 was blue, and 7 was green, and for some reason they're stuck with these memories. But this never made much sense to me, because why would it then run in families? You'd have to say they're passing the same magnets down. Or the propensity to play with magnets runs in families, or something like that. Anyway, it didn't make much sense, but it's something you have to bear in mind. The fourth explanation is more subtle, and it invokes sensory metaphors. If you look at our ordinary language, it's replete with synesthetic metaphors, cross-sensory metaphors, such as, for example, if you say cheddar cheese is sharp. Well, cheese isn't sharp. You can take a piece of cheese, rub it on your skin. It's actually soft. So why do you say it's sharp? Well, you say, oh, no. What I mean is it tastes sharp. It's a metaphor. But this is circular. Why do you use a tactile adjective, touch, sharp, for a taste sensation? Now, the problem with this explanation is that in science, you can never explain one mystery with another mystery. Saying that synesthesia is just a metaphor doesn't explain a damn thing, because we don't know what a metaphor is or how it's represented in the brain. And indeed, as we go along, what I'd like to do is to turn it upside down and suggest the very opposite, that synesthesia is a sensory phenomenon whose neural basis you can discover in the brain, and that in turn can give you an experimental foothold for understanding more elusive aspects of the mind, such as what is a metaphor. So why has it been ignored? There's an important lesson here in the history of science. And I think in general it's fair to say that for a curious phenomenon, an anomaly, to make it into mainstream science and have an impact, it has to fulfill 3 criteria. And that is, first, you have to show it's a real phenomenon. Second, you have to have a candidate mechanism that explains what it might be. And third, it has to have broad implications. What's a big deal? So what? Who cares? Okay. So for example, if you take telepathy, okay, telepathy has vast implications if true. So the third criterion is fulfilled. But the first criterion is not fulfilled. It's not repeatable. We don't even know if it's true. It's probably bogus. Another example would be bacterial transformation. If you take one species of bacteria, pneumococcus, and incubate it with another species of bacterium, the second species actually becomes transformed into the first species. And you can do this just extracting the chemical, the DNA, and then use that to induce the transformation. And this was reliably repeatable. Many times it was repeated. It was published in a prestigious journal. But people ignored it. Okay? Why did they ignore it? Because nobody could think of a candidate mechanism. How can you possibly encode heredity in a chemical? Until Watson and Crick came along, described the double helical structure of DNA, described the genetic code, and then people started accepting it and recognized the importance of bacterial transformation. So I like to do the same thing with synesthesia. First of all, I like to show it's real, it's not bogus. Second, suggest candidate mechanisms, what's going on in the brain. And third, so what? Why should I care? So I'm going to argue, in fact, synesthesia has very broad implications. Might tell you about things like metaphor and how language evolved in the brain, maybe even the emergence of abstract thought that us humans, human beings are very good at. So first, we need to show synesthesia is a real phenomenon. What we did was to essentially develop a clinical test for discovering closet synesthetes. And how do you do that? First of all, we found 2 synesthetes, and these people saw numbers as colored. For example, 5 as red and 2 as green. So we produced a computerized display on the screen which had a random jumble of 5s on the screen. And embedded among these 5s are a number of 2s. And the 2s are arranged to form a shape like a triangle or a square or a circle. Now, when you and I, anybody here in the audience who's not a synesthete, looks at this display, it takes several seconds, as much as 20 or 30 seconds, before you say, oh, I see all the 2s, they're arranged to form a triangle or a square. Now, when we showed the same display to the 2 synesthetes, they immediately, or very quickly, saw the triangle or the square. Because the numbers are actually colored for them, they see them conspicuously popping out from the background. So this demolishes the idea they're just crazy, because if they're crazy, how come they're better at it than all of you normals? Okay? It also suggests that it's a genuine sensory effect, because if it's just a memory association or something high level, how come they actually see the triangle? So we know the phenomenon is real. And using this test and other similar tests, we were able to show that it's much more common than people had assumed in the past. In fact, people have claimed that it's 1 in 10,000. We find it's 1 in 200. There's probably 2 or 3 of you here in the audience who don't want to admit it, okay? So the next question is, what causes synesthesia? Well, my student, especially Ed Hubbard, he and I were looking at brain atlases, and we found, if you look at a structure called the fusiform gyrus in the temporal lobes of the brain, it turns out that the fusiform gyrus has the color area, V4, which is described by Semir Zeki. This is the area which processes color information. But we were struck by the fact that the number area of the brain, which represents visual numbers, as shown by brain imaging studies, that number area is right next to it, almost touching the color area of the brain. So we said, this can't be a coincidence. How come the most common type of synesthesia is number color, and the number area and color area are almost touching each other, right next to each other, in the same part of the brain? Maybe what's going on is these people have some accidental crosstalk or cross-wiring, just as in my experiments on phantom limbs, in my London lecture I showed that the face area becomes cross-wired with the hand area in the cortex. Except in this case, it happens not because of amputation, but because of some genetic change in the brain. And now we've done imaging experiments on people with synesthesia and showed that if you show just black and white numbers, they get activation in the color area. Now the next question is, why does this cross-wiring or cross-activation occur? Well, remember I said it runs in families. Well, this suggests there's a gene or set of genes involved. What might this gene be doing, this bad gene? Well, one possibility is we are all born with excess connections in the brain. In the fetus, there are many more redundant connections than you need, and then you prune away the excess connections to produce the modular architecture characteristic of the adult brain. Okay, like Michelangelo chipped away everything that doesn't look like David to produce David. Okay, that's how you generate a brain. Okay, so I think what's happened in these people is that gene is defective, and therefore there's defective pruning, so there's cross-activation between adjacent regions of the brain. Or there could be some kind of chemical imbalance that produces cross-activation. between adjacent parts of the brain that are normally only loosely connected, and this produces a hyperconnectivity between these parts of the brain. Now, what we found next was even more amazing. Take the same two synesthetes. Instead of showing them Arabic numbers, actually I should call them Indian numbers, but it doesn't matter, okay? Indian Arabic numbers, you show them, instead of showing them that, you show them Roman numbers, Roman 5, which looks like a V, or 6. Guess what happens? They say, oh, I know it's a 5, but it doesn't look colored. It's black and white. So Roman numbers don't evoke colors. Now, what does that prove? It's very important because it shows it's not the numerical concept that drives the color, but the visual appearance of the Indian Arabic number. And it fits with what I'm saying because the fusiform gyrus represents the visual appearance of numbers and letters and things like that, not the abstract concept of sequence or ordinality. Okay? Where does that occur, the abstract idea of number? We don't know, but a good guess is angular gyrus in the left hemisphere. We know that because when that's damaged in patients, they can no longer, they're fluent in conversation, they're intelligent, and all of that, but they can't do even simple arithmetic. You say, what's 17 minus 3? He'll say, oh, is it 9? Gets it completely wrong. So we think that abstract number concepts are represented in the angular gyrus. And remember, this chap's cross-wiring is in the fusiform gyrus, between the visual appearance of the number and the color. Now, however, we then found this is not true of all synesthetes. All synesthetes are not made equal. We then ran into other synesthetes where it's not merely a number that evokes color, but even days of the week evoke colors. Monday is red, Tuesday is indigo, Wednesday is blue. Months of the year evoke color. December is yellow, January is red, February is indigo. No wonder people thought they were crazy. But remember, if you're a clinician, you know, when somebody sounds crazy, it usually means you're not smart enough to figure it out, okay? He isn't crazy, okay. What do calendars, what do days of the week, months of the year, and numbers have in common? What they all have in common is the abstract idea of sequence or ordinality. So what I'm claiming is that's represented in the angular gyrus, higher up, in the TPO junction, temporoparieto-occipital junction, in the vicinity of the angular gyrus. And guess what? The next color area in the sequence is higher up in the general vicinity of the TPO junction, not far from the angular gyrus. So what I'm arguing is, in these people, the cross-wiring is higher up in the angular gyrus. Then you get a higher synesthete. So if the faulty gene is selectively expressed in the fusiform gyrus, lower, at an earlier stage in processing, you get a lower synesthete driven by the visual appearance. If it's expressed selectively higher up in the vicinity of the angular gyrus, you get a higher synesthete driven by the numerical concept rather than by the visual appearance. Okay, next question. Why did this gene survive? 1 in 200 people have this peculiarity of seeing colored numbers, and it's completely useless. So why hasn't it vanished from the population? And I'm going to suggest it's a bit like sickle cell anemia. There's a hidden agenda. These genes are doing something else important. What? Well, one of the odd facts about synesthesia, which has been known for a long time, and again been ignored, is the fact that synesthesia is much more common among artists, poets, novelists, just flaky types. So now, why is it much more common? Well, one view is, in fact, according to one study, it's 7 times more common among artists, poets, and novelists. And the reason is, what do artists, poets, and novelists all have in common? Just think about it. What they all have in common is they're very good at metaphor, namely linking seemingly unrelated concepts in their brain, such as if you say, out, brief candle. So that there's life, why do you call it a candle? Is it because life is like a long white thing? Obviously not. You don't take the metaphor literally, although schizophrenics do, and we won't go into that, okay? So why do you do that? You say, well, no, it's brief like a candle. It can be snuffed out like a candle. It illumines like a candle very briefly, okay? Your brain makes all the right links, right? And Shakespeare, of course, was a master of doing this. Now, imagine one further assumption. If this gene is expressed more diffusely, instead of being just expressed in the fusiform or in the angular, if it's expressed in the fusiform, you get a lower synesthete. In the angular gyrus TPO junction, you get a higher synesthete. If it's expressed everywhere, you get greater hyperconnectivity throughout the brain, making you more prone to metaphor, link seemingly unrelated things, because after all, concepts are also represented in brain maps. This may seem counterintuitive, but after all, a number, there's nothing more abstract than a number. You can have 5 pigs, 5 donkeys, 5 chairs. It's fiveness, and that's represented in a fairly small region, namely the angular gyrus. So it's possible that concepts are also represented in brain maps, and these people have excess connections, so they can make these associations much more fluidly and effortlessly than all of us less gifted people. Now, remember I said the third thing you have to do in science is show that this is not just some quirk, it has vast implications. Well, what implications does synesthesia have? Well, I'm going to show all of you that synesthesia is not just a quirk in some people's brain. All of you here are synesthetes. Now, I'm going to do an experiment. I want you all of you to imagine in front of you, to visualize in front of you, a bulbous amoeboid shape, which looks has lots of curves on it, undulating curves. And right next to it, imagine a jagged, like a piece of shattered glass with jagged shapes. And just for fun, I'm going to tell you, this is Martian alphabet, okay? Just as in English alphabet, A is A, B is B, you've got each shape with a particular sound. This is Martian alphabet. And one of these shapes is Kiki, and the other is Booba, okay? And I want you to tell me which is which. How many of you think the bulbous shape is the Kiki? Raise your hands. Well, there's one mutation there. But in fact, what you find is, if you do this experiment, 98% of people say the jagged shape, the shattered glass, is Kiki, and the bulbous amoeboid shape is a Booba. Now, why is that? You've never learned Martian, and nobody here is a Martian. Well, the answer is you're all synesthetes, but you're in denial about it. And I'll explain. Look at the Kiki, and look at the sound Kiki. They both share one property. The Kiki visual shape has a sharp inflection, and the sound Kiki, represented in your auditory cortex and the hearing centers in the brain, also has a sharp, sudden inflection of the sound. And the brain performs a cross-modal synesthetic abstraction, saying the only thing they have in common is the property of jaggedness. Let me extract that property. That's why they're both Kiki. Okay? Fine. So what? Well, I'll explain. We have taken the same patterns I've just told you about, the Booba Kiki, and shown it to patients who have damage to a very small lesion in the angular gyrus of the left hemisphere. And guess what? If you show them these two shapes and ask them to associate Kiki with the two shapes, Kiki and Booba, they're at random. And by the way, we don't use just these two shapes. We have a whole set of them. And they cannot do this cross-modal associations, even though they're fluent in conversation, they're intelligent, they seem normal in other respects. Now, this makes perfect sense because the angular gyrus is strategically located at the crossroads between the parietal lobe, concerned with touch and proprioception, the temporal lobe concerned with hearing, occipital lobe concerned with vision. So it is strategically placed to allow a convergence of different sense modalities to create abstract modality-free representations of things around you. Now, think of what this involves. Think of the jagged shape and the sound, Kiki. They have nothing in common. One is photons hitting the retina in parallel, and the other is a sharp sound hitting the hair cells sequentially. But the brain abstracts the common denominator, saying, but jaggedness is common, or the property of undulation is common. So what you're seeing here in the angular gyrus is the beginnings of the property that we call abstraction, that us human beings excel in. Okay? And another point I'd like to make is, why did this ability evolve in humans in the first place? Cross-modal abstraction. Well, it turns out if you look at lower mammals, compare them with monkeys, then compare them with the great apes, and then with humans, there's a progressive enlargement of the TPO junction and angular gyrus. Okay, almost an explosive development, and it's especially large in us humans. Why? Well, I think this ability evolved because imagine your ancestors scurrying up on the treetops, trying to grab branches, jumping from branch to branch. They got a visual horizontal branch, and then they have to adjust the angle of the arm and the fingers so that the proprioceptive map has to match the horizontality of the visual appearance. And that's why the angular gyrus became larger and larger. But once you develop this ability to engage in cross-modal abstraction, that structure in turn became an exaptation for other types of abstraction that us humans excel in, be it metaphor or any other type of abstraction. So that's the claim being made here. Now, finally, I would like to turn to language. How did language evolve? This has always been a very controversial topic. And the question is, look, here we have this amazing ability called language with all the nesting of clauses, this hierarchical structure of language, this recursive embedding of clauses, an enormous lexicon, and it's an extraordinarily sophisticated mechanism. How could it possibly have evolved through the blind workings of chance, through natural selection? How did we evolve from the grunts and howls and groans of our ape-like ancestors to all the sophistication of a Shakespeare or a George Bush? Okay? Now, there have been several theories about this. Alfred Russel Wallace said the mechanism is so complicated it couldn't have evolved through natural selection. It was done by God, divine intervention. Maybe he's right, but we can't test it, so let's throw it away. Okay? Next theory was by Chomsky. Chomsky said actually something quite similar, although he doesn't use the word God. He said this mechanism is so sophisticated and elaborate, it couldn't have emerged through natural selection, through the blind workings of chance. But God knows what happens if you pack 100 billion nerve cells into such a tiny space. You may get new laws of physics emerging. Aha, that's how you explain language. So he almost says it's a miracle, although he doesn't use the word miracle. Now, even if that's true, we can't test it, so let's throw it away. So then what actually happened? How did language evolve? I suggest that the clue, the vital clue, comes from the Booba Kiki example, from synesthesia. And I'd like to replace this idea with what I call the synesthetic bootstrapping theory of language origins. Okay? And I'll get to that in a minute. So the next idea is Pinker's idea. And his idea is, look, there's no big mystery here. You're seeing the final result of evolution of language, but you don't know what the intermediate steps are. So it always looks mysterious. But of course it evolved through natural selection, even though we don't know what the steps were. Now, I think he's right, but he doesn't go far enough. Because as biologists, we know the devil's in the details. We want to know what those intermediate steps are. Not merely that it could have happened through natural selection. Of course it happened through natural selection. There is nothing else. So let's take the lexicon, words. How did we evolve such a wonderful, a huge repertoire of words, thousands of words? Did our ancestral hominids sit near the fireplace and say, let's look at that? Okay, everybody call it an axe. Axe, say everybody axe. Okay. Of course not. I mean, you do that in kindergarten, but that's not what they did. If they didn't do that, what did they do? Well, what I'm arguing is that the Booba Kiki example provides the clue. It shows there is a pre-existing translation between the visual appearance of the object represented in the fusiform gyrus and the auditory representation in the auditory cortex. In other words, there's already a synesthetic cross-modal abstraction going on, a pre-existing translation, if you like, between the visual appearance and the auditory representation. Now, admittedly, this is a very small bias, okay? But that's all you need in evolution to get it started. And then you can start embellishing it, okay? But that's only part of the story, part one. Part two, I'm going to argue, there's also a pre-existing, built-in cross-activation. Just as there is between visual and auditory, the Booba Kiki effect, there's also between visual in the fusiform and the motor Broca's area in the front of the brain that controls the sequence of activations of muscles of vocalization, phonation, and articulation, lips, tongue, and mouth. How do I know that? Well, let's take an example. Let's take the example of something tiny. Say, teeny weeny, un peu, diminutive. Look at what my lips are doing. The amazing thing is they're actually physically mimicking the visual appearance of the object versus enormous, large, where you're actually physically mimicking the visual appearance of the object. So what I'm arguing is that also, again, a pre-existing bias to map certain visual shapes onto certain sounds in the motor maps in the Broca's area. Lastly, the third factor, I think there's also a pre-existing cross-activation between the hand area and the mouth area, because they're right next to each other in the Penfield motor map in the brain. And let me give you an example. And I got scooped. Charles Darwin first described this, okay? What he showed was when people cut with a pair of scissors, you clench and unclench your jaws unconsciously as if to echo or mimic the movements of the fingers, right? He didn't explain why, but I like to give it a name. I call it synkinesia. And that's because the hand and mouth areas are right next to each other, and maybe there is some spillover of signals. Now, so what? Well, imagine your ancestral hominids evolving a system of gestures for communication. Okay, and this would have been important because vocalization you can't engage in when you're hunting. Now, the right hemisphere produces guttural emotional utterances along with the anterior cingulate. Now, your mouth and tongue are already, there's a pre-existing translation of the visual symbols into mouth, lip, and tongue movements. Combine that with guttural utterances coming from the right hemisphere anterior cingulate. What do you get? You get the first words. You get proto-words. Okay? So now you've got three things in place. Hand to mouth and Broca's area to visual appearance in the fusiform, and auditory cortex, and auditory to visual, the Bouba-Kiki effect. Each of these is a small effect, but acting together. There's a synergistic bootstrapping effect going on, and an avalanche effect, culminating the emergence of language. Finally, you say, well, what about the hierarchical structure of syntax? How do you explain that? Well, I think, like when you say, he knows that I know that he knows that I know that I had an affair with his wife. Okay? How do you do this hierarchic embedding in language? Well, partly I think that comes from semantics, from the region of the TPO where I said you engage in abstraction, and I already explained how abstraction might have evolved. So partly abstraction feeds into syntactic structure, okay? But partly from tool use. Early hominids were very good at tool use, and especially what I call the sub-assembly technique in tool use, where you take a piece of flint, make it into a head, step one, then you haft it on to a handle, step two, and then the whole thing becomes one entity, which you then use to hit. You're the subject, you hit the object. You do something to the object, okay? And this bears a certain operational analogy with the embedding of noun clauses. So what I'm arguing is what you evolved for tool use in the hand area is now exapted and assimilated in the Broca's area to be used in syntactic hierarchic embedding. So now look, each of these is a small bias, but when acting in conjunction, they culminate in language. It's very different from Steve Pinker's idea, which is that language is a specific adaptation which evolves step by step for the sole purpose of communication. What I'm arguing is, no, it's the fortuitous, synergistic combination of number of mechanisms which evolved for other purposes initially, and then became assimilated into the mechanism that we call language. This often happens in evolution, but it's a style of thinking that has yet to permeate neurology and psychology. And it's very odd that neurologists don't usually think of evolution, given that nothing in biology makes any sense except in the light of evolution, as Dobzhansky once said. So let me summarize what we've done. We begin with a disorder that's been known for a century, but treated as a curiosity. And then we showed that the phenomenon is real, what the underlying brain mechanisms might be, and lastly spelled out what the broader implications of this curious phenomenon might be. So what have we done here with synesthesia? Let's take a look. One day we might be able to clone the gene or genes, because if you find a large enough family, you might be able to do this. Then we can go on to the brain anatomy and say, look, it's expressed in the fusiform gyrus, and you get lower synesthesia. You go to angular gyrus, you get higher synesthetes. If it's expressed all over, you get artsy types. Okay? Then from the brain anatomy, you go to detailed perceptual psychophysics. Either the pop-out effect, the 2s against the 5s, which you can measure, and then finally all the way to understanding abstract thought and how it might have emerged, metaphor, Shakespeare, even the evolution of language. All of this in this one little quirk that people used to call synesthesia. So I agree wholeheartedly with what Huxley said in the last century, just across the road here at the University Museum. Contrary to Benjamin Disraeli's view, or the views of Bishop Wilberforce, we are not angels. We are merely sophisticated apes. Yet we feel like angels, trapped inside the bodies of beasts, craving transcendence, and all the time trying to spread our wings and fly off. And it's really a very odd predicament to be in if you think about it. Thank you.
So synesthesia lives, it's real, says Ramachandran. And what's more, it has great implications for the understanding of how our language evolved. Do his fellow scientists, or indeed the artsy types, or the mere mortals in our audience, buy all of this? Are you convinced? Are you puzzled? Let's find out. Let's take our first question, please. Where are we? Gentleman down here.
Richard Dawkins, University of Oxford. If we ask where the sensation of redness comes from in evolution, or blueness, it seems to me likely that it's a convenient label that the brain uses to make a salient external distinction. If that's the case, would you agree with me that it's likely that an animal like a bat, which doesn't see but which hears with echoes, uses colour for its own purposes? Bats might hear in colour, rhinoceroses might smell in colour.
Yes, I think this raises the question of qualia, the actual subjective sensation of redness and greenness and blueness, whether this has an evolutionary function. And I agree with you wholeheartedly that in the case of a bat, which doesn't actually discriminate wavelength, but discriminates texture by echolocation, it might, given the conservative nature of evolution, utilize those same labels, qualia labels, which you and I use for wavelength. They may use for texture, labeling auditory texture. And of course, it's very hard to test. But one thing I would say is that something's vaguely relevant to what you're saying is we have recently come across a colorblind synesthete. Now, this may sound like an oxymoron. Basically, he was color anomalous. He didn't have the full range of pigments in his eye, so he couldn't see the full range of colors. He saw only a narrow range of colors in the real world. But the amazing thing is when he saw black and white numbers, he would say he would see colors which he couldn't see in the real world. And he referred to them charmingly as Martian colors. Now, this doesn't make any sense initially, but it makes perfect sense in terms of what I'm saying, because what I'm arguing is this guy doesn't have the color pigments in his eye, or is deficient in them, but the fusiform gyrus is fine, and all the color regions there. So he's indirectly activating them through the number representations. And therefore, he sees color phosphenes, and he experiences colors which he cannot experience in the real world because he doesn't have the receptors. So in a sense, you're skipping the receptors and evoking qualia, color qualia, which he has never experienced. So this subject, in fact, experiences qualia which he has never experienced before.
Gentleman here.
David Deutsch from the Centre for Quantum Computation at the University of Oxford. This marvellous phenomena and a marvellous talk, by the way. You said that science, this kind of science, can address elusive questions like what are qualia and what is making metaphors. Do you think that there are any questions about the workings of the mind which science in principle can't address, but which must always remain in the realm of philosophy?
Well, no, that's a big question. I mean, it's one could spend the next few hours talking about that, and people in Oxford have been discussing it for hundreds of years, you know. Briefly, as a working scientist studying the brain, looking at the phenomena of perception, synesthesia, changes in perception, changes in body image, even changes in your sense of willing something, free will, which people think of as a philosophical question, we have never encountered a situation where we felt, oh, you have to invoke something else, something supernatural. To quote, was it Newton? You know, we don't need that hypothesis, okay, to phrase it in that way. Now, that doesn't mean that we have explained everything. In particular, you know, here's an obvious question. You've got the little specks of jelly firing away. How do you explain the sensation of redness? Maybe there's an epistemological barrier. You've got these neurons firing away. How does it explain what red is? But you see, you don't do that even in the rest of science. You don't say, what is an electron? I mean, if you were an electron, what would it be like? You don't ask that. You just say, this is how it behaves. And that's enough for me. So why is the brain any different?
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to take a question here.
I'm Sarah Witherby. If the most common form of synesthesia, coloured numbers, can be explained in terms of the cross-activation of the adjacent areas responsible for number recognition and colour processing, why don't we find equally common instances of synesthetic facial recognition, given that the relevant brain areas are equally adjacent?
Yes. So if you look at the fusiform gyrus, it's not merely numbers represented there, but faces are too, as you know, from the work of Ed Rolls and Perrett and Charlie Gross and others. Now, being next to each other, two maps being already connected or being next to each other may be a necessary condition, but may not be sufficient. In other words, the nature of representation of numbers may be sufficiently simple in the form of number nodes. It's not as complex as faces. That it's a small enough node that it may be easier to develop connectivity with specific colors than the manner in which faces are represented. By the way, we have seen one of our synesthetes with facial expression. He gets beautiful synesthesia. Each expression encodes a particular color. An even more exotic variant is tasting shapes. I mean, I have a subject who, when he feels hamburger patties, it's bitter in his mouth. And of course, there's Cytowick's famous example of things tasting pointy. And that's because it turns out that the hand and mouth representation in the Penfield sensory map is right next to the insular cortex, which receives gustatory taste sensations. So if there is some cross-activation there, you would expect exactly that, namely shapes producing taste or taste producing shapes.
We've got a taster of shapes or a taster of words here somewhere, have we not?
Yep. My name's James Wannerton, by the way. I'm a gustatory auditory synesthete in that when I hear words and word sounds, I get taste after taste.
Give us an example.
Well, example, then I got tomato soup. I mean, it happens all the time. It's just one after another.
So if I say professor, what do you get?
That's it's a very thin, meaty kind of thing. I mean, the professor's name is actually Lucasade.
What?
I mean, when I look at him, he's Lucasade. I get Lucasade when he's saying things.
Do you want to comment on that? Question here.
I can't explain everything.
Robin Dunbar, University of Liverpool. I guess from an evolutionary biologist's point of view, I'm bound to ask what the selective advantage that the artists and writers have out of all this. Why is this sort of... I mean, they must be reproducing more successfully or gaining more mates. And as a slightly worrying afterthought is if scientists are distinguished from the arty types by not being very metaphorical and synesthetic in this sort of way, we're in danger of being bred out of the...
Well, I think that the trouble is we don't have an adequate taxonomy of the intellect and of abstract thinking and creativity and metaphor and things like that. Loosely speaking, it's a good idea to have some people in the population to be outliers in certain abilities, such as creativity and linking things, maybe even artistic ability. And maybe that's why the gene survived. And it doesn't do any harm, after all. There's no harm in seeing fives as red. It doesn't hurt them. So it just hangs around and doesn't disappear from the population because it does confer benefit on these outliers, which in turn would benefit the kin who share the gene. So from that point of view, there may be a hidden benefit, such as the sickle cell anemia gene. People have suggested things like this for schizophrenia, by the way, but I think this is, as far as I know, is the first time somebody suggested it for synesthesia.
Jamie Ward, University College London. My question was, what's so special about colour? Because colour is far and away the most common synesthetic experience. And why, for example, if C-sharp produces blue, why wouldn't blue produce C-sharp if it's just cross-activation?
Yeah. It's a very good question. You do see this directionality effect. Maybe the way colour is mapped, it's inherently easier to go one way in the activation than to go other way. And this isn't true just of synesthesia. If you take just metaphors in ordinary language, people think metaphors are completely random, but they're not. In fact, Lakoff and Johnson and others have shown that metaphors are also directional. Certain directions like sound to touch or vision to hearing versus hearing to vision are much more common. And there's no way you can explain this except in terms of anatomical constraints in the brain. I think that even your Shakespearean English and metaphor is constrained by anatomy.
Lady there.
Janie Hampton, arty typewriter. One almost universal word I can think of is mama, which to me represents warmth and milkiness and softness. But why don't we all speak the same language if we've all started off with mama?
Why don't we all have the same language, is your question. So, for example, take dog. You say dog in English, chien in French, kutta in Hindi, Nai in Tamil, they bear no resemblance. Well, the answer is I'm not talking about modern language. I'm talking about the proto-language, the ancestral language. And in evolution, that's what you have to explain in the early band of hominids who got it going. Once you get it going and it spreads throughout the world, you can get culture coming in, and you can have arbitrary words kicking in, okay? Because you've got the scaffolding in place. That's the difficult part. And that happens through this bootstrapping process I was talking about. And once that's emerged, then you can branch off using culture, and all of these arbitrary junk comes into the picture, which I'm not interested in as a scientist. You know.
Vincent Walsh, University College London. Watching your mouth saying enormous and teeny weeny, I couldn't help but think what a disappointing word penis was.
It's probably invented by feminists.
I think with the penis anomaly, we'll end it there, Rama. Next week, we're going home with Rama to the Neurosciences Institute in San Diego, California, Neuron Valley, as it's becoming known. There, in the climax to this series, he'll pull together the threads that he's woven over the past 4 weeks, and having described the evolution of language and the nature of art appreciation, he will, among other things, enter the Holy of Holies and attempt to explain why the brain is prone, anyway, to religious belief. For now, our thanks to our Reith Lecturer 2003, Villanor Ramachandran, and good night. Good evening and welcome to the Neurosciences Institute in La Jolla near San Diego. Established 22 years ago, it exists to foster research by scientists of different disciplines into the working of the human brain. The men and women who work here have been responsible for making important discoveries about our behavior, our sleep, our memory, our movement, and our consciousness. The driving ethos of this place is one of high risk, high payoff. It is, and it does. So here we are in a spectacular limestone, glass and stainless steel building perched on a hillside a stone's throw away from the Pacific Ocean. Our lecturer, Villanor Ramachandran, one of the world's leading neuroscientists, is a fellow of this institute. It's therefore the perfect place for him to conclude his series of lectures entitled The Emerging Mind. In his first lecture in London, Rama talked about how the scientific revolutions of Copernicus, Darwin, and Freud had transformed the way we view ourselves and our place in the cosmos. He told us that we're now poised for the greatest revolution of all, the understanding of the human brain. He went on in lectures in Edinburgh, Birmingham, and Oxford to describe, with the aid of fascinating case studies, how abnormal behaviour can illuminate the workings of the normal brain. Tonight, as you gather, he's back on his home ground here in California to draw together the threads of his argument and explain why, as the title of this evening's lecture puts it, neuroscience has become the new philosophy. We have an audience of students, faculty members, friends of the Institute, at least 3 Nobel Prize winners, as far as I know, there may be more, and I suspect not a few people who would simply describe themselves as fans. So, scientists or groupies, they'll all have a chance to put a question or comments later. Will you now welcome our Reith Lecturer 2003, Professor Villanor Ramachandran.
Thank you, Sue, for that wonderful introduction. The main theme of our lectures so far has been the idea that the study of patients with neurological disorders has implications far beyond the confines of medical neurology, implications even for the humanities, for philosophy, maybe even for aesthetics and art. Today, I'd like to continue this theme and take up the challenge of mental illness. The boundary between neurology and psychiatry is becoming increasingly blurred, and it's only a matter of time before psychiatry becomes just another branch of neurology. I'll also touch on a few philosophical issues like free will and the nature of self. Now, if you look at ideas on mental illness, there have been traditionally 2 different approaches to mental illness. The first one tries to identify chemical imbalances, changes in transmitters and receptors in the brain, and attempts to correct these changes using drugs. And this approach has revolutionized psychiatry. It's been phenomenally successful. Patients who used to be put in straitjackets or locked up can now lead relatively normal lives. The second approach we can loosely characterize as the so-called Freudian approach. It assumes that most mental illness arises from your upbringing, maybe your mother. In this lecture, what I'd like to do is to propose a third approach, which is radically different from either of these, but in a sense complements them. My point is, if you really want to understand the origins of mental illness, it's not enough to merely say that some transmitter has changed in the brain. You want to know how the change in the transmitter produces the bizarre symptoms that it does. Why patients have those specific symptoms, which you see, and why the symptoms are different for different types of mental illness. That's our agenda here. And what I'd like to do is to try and explain the symptoms you see in mental illness in terms of the known function and the known anatomy and neural structures in the brain. And that will be the goal of this lecture. And I'll suggest that many of these symptoms and disorders will seem less bizarre when viewed from an evolutionary standpoint, that is, from a Darwinian perspective. So let's give this discipline a new name. I'd like to call this discipline evolutionary neuropsychiatry. Let's take the classic example of what people think of as a purely mental disorder, psychological disturbance, hysteria. Now, I'm using the word here in the strictly medical sense, not somebody, becoming hysterical and shouting and screaming. In the strictly medical sense, the word means that here is a patient who suddenly develops a paralysis of an arm or a leg, but if you examine this patient, neurologically there are no deficits. Brain MR scan reveals that the brain is apparently completely normal. There are no identifiable lesions. There's no damage. So the symptoms are dismissed as being purely psychological in origin. But recent brain imaging studies using PET scans and functional magnetic resonance imaging have dramatically changed our understanding of hysteria. Using PET scans and fMR, we can now find what parts of the brain are active or inactive, for example, when a patient does some specific action or some mental process. And you can find out what parts of the brain light up when he does it. For example, when you do arithmetic, mental arithmetic, what parts of the brain lights up? It's usually the left angular gyrus, it turns out. Or when I prick you with a needle and there's pain, what part of the brain lights up? What are the pathways involved? And this tells you that that particular pathway that's lighting up is somehow involved in mediating that function. If I take any one of you here and ask you to wiggle your finger, and I do a PET scan to see what parts of the brain light up, and Kornhuber and Libet actually did this some decades ago, what I find is that two areas light up in the brain. One is called the motor cortex, which is actually sending messages to execute the appropriate sequence of muscle twitches to wiggle your finger. But also another area in front of it called the prefrontal cortex that prepares you to move your finger. So there's an initial area which prepares you to move your finger, and then there's the motor cortex that actually that executes the motor programs to make you wiggle your finger. Okay, fine. But what if you now try this experiment on a hysterical patient who's hysterically paralyzed? He says his arm isn't moving, but there are no neurological abnormalities. What if you did a PET scan in his brain and you ask him to move his so-called paralyzed arm? He says, no, I can't do it. You say, try anyway and do a PET scan. This is done by Chris Firth and Frakowiak and Peter Halligan and John Marshall and others. And what they found was when a person with hysterical paralysis tries to move his arm, again, the premotor area lights up, and this means he's not faking it. He's intending to move the arm. But in addition to that, there's another area that lights up, and that is the anterior cingulate and the ventromedial frontal lobes, parts of the frontal cortex. This means he has every intention of moving it, but the anterior cingulate and parts of the frontal lobes are inhibiting or vetoing this attempt to move the arm in the hysterical patient. And this makes sense because the anterior cingulate and parts of the frontal lobes are intimately linked to the limbic emotional centers in the brain. And we know that hysteria originates from some emotional trauma that's somehow preventing him from moving his arm, and his arm is paralyzed. So we've talked about hysterical patients with hysterical paralysis. Now, let's go back to normals and do a PET scan when you're voluntarily moving your finger, using your free will. A second to 3/4 of a second prior to moving your finger, I get the EEG potential, and it's called the readiness potential. It's as though the brain events are kicking in a second prior to your actual finger movement, even though your conscious intention of moving the finger coincides almost exactly with the wiggle of the finger. Why? Why is the mental sensation of willing the finger delayed by a second, coming a second after the brain events kick in, as monitored by the EEG? What might the evolutionary rationale be? The answer is, I think, that there is an inevitable neural delay before the signal arising in the brain cascades through the brain and the message arrives to wiggle your finger. There's going to be a delay because of neural processing. Just like, those satellite interviews on TV, which you've all been watching. So natural selection has ensured that the subjective sensation of willing is delayed deliberately to coincide not with the onset of the brain commands, but with the actual execution of the command by your finger, so that you feel you're moving it. And this in turn is telling you something important. It's telling you that the subjective sensations that accompany brain events must have an evolutionary purpose. For if it had no purpose and merely accompanied brain events, like so many philosophers believe, this is called epiphenomenalism. In other words, the subjective sensation of willing is just like a shadow that moves with you as you walk, but is not causal in making you move. If that's correct, then why would evolution bother delaying the signal so that it coincides with your finger movement? So you see, the amazing paradox is that on the one hand, the experiment shows that free will is illusory, right? It can't be causing the brain events because the events kick in a second earlier. But on the other hand, it has to have some function, because if it didn't have a function, why would evolution bother delaying it? But if it does have a function, what could it be other than moving the finger? Okay? So maybe our very notion of causation requires a radical revision here, as happened in quantum physics. Okay, enough of free will. That's all philosophy. I would now like to remind you of a syndrome we discussed in my first lecture, the Capgras delusion. So the patient has been in a head injury, say a car accident. He seems quite normal in most respects, neurologically intact, but suddenly starts saying his mother is an imposter. She's some other woman pretending to be my mother. Now, why would this happen, especially after a head injury? Now, remember, he's quite normal in all other respects. Well, it turns out that in this patient, the wire that goes from the visual areas to the emotional core of the brain, the limbic system and the amygdala, that's been cut by the accident. So he looks at the mother, and since the visual areas in the brain, concerned with recognizing faces, is not damaged, he says, hey, it looks just like my mother. But then there is no emotion because that wire taking that information to the emotional centers is cut. So he says, if this is my mother, how come I don't experience any emotions? This must be some other strange woman. She's an imposter. Well, how do you test this? It turns out you can measure the gut-level emotional reaction that someone has to a visual stimulus or any stimulus by measuring the extent to which they sweat. Believe it or not, all of you here, if I show you something exciting, emotionally important, you start sweating. To dissipate the heat you're going to generate from exercise, from action. And I can measure the sweating by putting 2 electrodes on your skin, changes in skin resistance, and if skin resistance falls, this is called the galvanic skin response. So every time any one of you here looks at tables and chairs, there's no galvanic skin response because you don't get emotionally aroused if you look at a table or a chair. If you look at strangers, there's no galvanic skin response. But if you look at lions and tigers, and as it turns out, if you look at your mother, you get a huge, big galvanic skin response. And you don't have to be Jewish either, okay? Anybody here looking at your mother, you get a huge, big galvanic skin response when you look at your mother. Now, what happens to the patient? We've tried this on patients. The patient looks at chairs and tables, nothing happens. But then we show him a picture of his mother on the screen. No galvanic skin response, it's flat. Supporting our idea that there's been a disconnection between vision and emotion. Now, the Capgras delusion is bizarre enough, but I'll tell you about an even more bizarre disorder. This is called the Cotard syndrome, in which the patient starts claiming he's dead. I suggested that this is a bit like Capgras, except that instead of vision alone being disconnected from the emotional centers in the brain, all the senses, everything gets disconnected from the emotional centers. So nothing he looks at in the world makes any sense, has any emotional significance to this person, whether it's he sees it or touches it or looks at it. Nothing has any emotional impact. And the only way this patient can interpret this complete emotional desolation is to say, "Oh, I'm dead, doctor." Okay, however bizarre it seems to you, it's the only interpretation that makes sense to him. Now, Capgras and Cotard are both rare syndromes. But there's another disorder, a sort of mini Cotards, that's much more commonly seen in clinical practice. Those of you here who are psychiatrists know this, or psychologists. It's called derealization and depersonalization. It's seen in acute anxiety, panic attacks, depression, and dissociative states. Suddenly the world seems completely unreal, like a dream. Or you may feel that you're not real. Doctor, I feel like a zombie. Why does this happen? As I said, it's quite common. I think it involves the same circuits as Capgras and Cotard's. You've all heard of the phrase playing possum. An opossum, when chased by a predator, suddenly loses all muscle tone and plays dead. Why? This is because any movement by the possum will encourage the predatory behavior of the carnivore, and carnivores also avoid dead, infected food. So playing dead is very adaptive, okay, for the possum. Following the lead of Martin Roth and Sierra and Berrios, I suggest that derealization and depersonalization and other dissociative states are an example of playing possum in the emotional realm. And I'll explain. It's an evolutionarily adaptive mechanism. Remember the story of Livingston being mauled by a lion. He saw his arm being ripped off, but felt no pain or even fear. He felt like he was detached from it all, watching it all happen. The same thing happens, by the way, to soldiers in battle, or sometimes even to women being raped. During such dire emergencies, the anterior cingulate in the brain, part of the frontal lobes, becomes extremely active. This inhibits or temporarily shuts down your amygdala and other limbic emotional centers, so you suppress potentially disabling emotions like anxiety and fear, temporarily. But at the same time, the anterior cingulate makes you extremely alert and vigilant, so you can take the appropriate action. Now, of course, in an emergency, this combination of shutting down emotions and being hyper-vigilant at the same time is useful, keeping you out of harm's way. It's best to do nothing than engage in some sort of erratic behavior. But what if the same mechanism is accidentally triggered by chemical imbalances or brain disease? When there is no emergency, you look at the world, you're intensely alert, hypervigilant, but it's completely devoid of emotional meaning because you've shut down your limbic system. And there are only two ways for you to interpret this dilemma. Either you say the world isn't real, and that's called derealization, or you say I'm not real, I feel empty, and that's called depersonalization. Epileptic seizures originating in this part of the brain can also produce these dreamy states of derealization and depersonalization. And, intriguingly, we know that during the actual seizure, when the patient is experiencing derealization, you can obtain a galvanic skin response and there's no response to anything. But once he comes out of the seizure, fine, he's normal. And all of this supports the hypothesis that I'm proposing. Okay, finally, let's talk about another disorder, the one that jumps into people's mind when they think of madness, namely schizophrenia. These are patients who have bizarre symptoms. They hallucinate, often hearing voices. They become delusional, thinking they're Napoleon or George Bush. Or they're convinced that the CIA has planted devices in their brain to control their thoughts and actions, or that aliens are controlling them. Psychopharmacology has revolutionized our ability to treat schizophrenia. But the question remains, why do they behave the way they do? I'd like to speculate on this based on some work we've done on anosognosia, denial of illness, which you see in right hemisphere lesions, and some very clever speculations by Chris Firth and Sarah Blakemore. Their idea is that unlike normal people, the schizophrenic can't tell the difference between his own internally generated images and thoughts versus perceptions that are evoked by real things outside. If any one of you here conjures up a mental picture of a clown in front of you, you don't confuse it with reality, partly because your brain has access to the internal command you gave. You're expecting to visualize a clown, that's why you see it, and you don't hallucinate. But if the mechanism in your brain that does this becomes faulty, then all of a sudden you can't tell the difference between a clown you're imagining and a clown you're actually seeing there. In other words, you hallucinate. You can't tell the difference between fantasy and reality. Similarly, you and I momentarily entertain the thought, it would be nice to be Napoleon. But in a schizophrenic, this momentary thought becomes a full-blown delusion instead of being vetoed by reality. What about the other symptoms in schizophrenia? The fact that aliens are controlling you. When you move your finger voluntarily, you know you sent the command. The motor centers in the brain sent the command. So you experience willing the movement. You don't say, oh, the finger moved on its own. But if the mechanism that performs this comparison is flawed, you no longer experience you willing the movement. So you come up with this bizarre interpretation. You say your movements are controlled by aliens or brain implants. And of course, that's what paranoid schizophrenics do. How do you test a theory like this? I want you all now to try an experiment. I mean that. I want you to try an experiment on yourselves. Using your right index finger, all of you try it. Tap repeatedly your left index finger, keeping the left index finger steady and inactive. So you're all tapping the left index finger using your right index finger. Left index finger is perfectly steady. Now, you feel the tapping only on the left finger, very little on the right finger. Okay, how many of you feel that? Yes, raise your hands. Okay, 99% of you. There are a few mutants, but we won't. Okay, now why is that? That's because the brain has sent a command from the left hemisphere to the right hand saying move. So the brain knows it's tipped off the sensory areas of the brain saying, look, you're going to move your right finger up and down, so it's going to get some touch signals, but ignore them. It's not important. On the other hand, the left hand is perfectly steady, so you feel the sensation only on the left finger, even though the tactile input is exactly the same. Now try it the other way. Hold the right finger steady, tap with the left finger, and you should now feel it mostly on the right and not on the left. Now the prediction is, if a schizophrenic tries this experiment, since he does not know the difference between internally generated actions and externally generated sensory stimuli, he will feel the sensations equally in both the fingers. It's a 5-minute experiment. Nobody's ever tried it. Okay? Another prediction, I can come here and tickle any one of you and you start laughing. Now, interestingly, you can't tickle yourself. Try as hard as you want, you cannot tickle yourself. That's because your brain knows you're sending the command. Prediction, a schizophrenic should be able to tickle himself. Okay, it's time to conclude now. I hope I've convinced you that even though the behavior of many patients with mental illness seems bizarre, we can now begin to make sense of the symptoms using our knowledge of basic brain mechanisms. You can think of mental illnesses as disturbances of consciousness and of self, two words that conceal vast depths of ignorance. Let me try to summarize in the remaining 5 or 10 minutes what my own view of consciousness is. There are really two problems here, the problem of the subjective sensations or qualia and the problem of self. The problem of qualia is the more difficult one. The question is, how does the flux of ions in little bits of jelly in my brain give rise to the redness of red, the flavor of marmite or matar paneer or wine? Matter and mind seem so utterly unlike each other. Well, one way out of this dilemma is to think of them really as two different ways of describing the world, each of which is complete in itself, Just as we can describe light as made up of particles or waves, and there's no point in asking which is correct, because they're both correct, and yet utterly unlike each other. And the same may be true of mental events and physical events in the brain. But what about the self? The last remaining great mystery in science. It's something that everybody's interested in, and especially if you're from India like me. Now, obviously, self and qualia are two sides of the same coin. You can't have free-floating sensations or qualia with no one to experience it, and you can't have a self completely devoid of sensory experiences, memories, or emotions. For example, as we saw in Cotard syndrome, sensations and perceptions lose all their significance and meaning, and this leads to a dissolution of self. What exactly do people mean when they speak of the self? Its defining characteristics are fourfold. First of all, continuity. You have a sense of time, a sense of past, a sense of future. There seems to be a thread running through your personality, through your mind. Second, closely related, is the idea of unity or coherence of self. In spite of the diversity of sensory experiences, memories, beliefs, and thoughts, you experience yourself as one person, as a unity. So there's continuity, there's unity, and then there's a sense of embodiment or ownership. Yourself is anchored to your body. And fourth, there's a sense of agency, what we call free will, your sense of being in charge of your own destiny. I moved my finger. Now, as we have seen in my lectures so far, these different aspects of self can be differentially disturbed in brain disease, which leads me to believe that the self really isn't one thing, but many, just like love or happiness. We have one word, but it's actually lumping together many different phenomena. For example, if I stimulate your right parietal cortex with an electrode, and you're conscious and awake, you will momentarily feel that you are floating near the ceiling, watching your own body down below. You have an out-of-the-body experience. The embodiment of self is abandoned. One of the axiomatic foundations of yourself is temporarily abandoned. And this is true of each of those aspects of self I was talking about. They can be selectively affected in brain disease. Keeping this in mind, I see three ways in which the problem of self might be tackled by neuroscience. First, maybe the problem of self is a straightforward empirical problem. Maybe there is a single, very elegant Pythagorean solution to the problem, just like DNA base pairing was a solution to the riddle of heredity. I think this is unlikely, but I could be wrong. Second, given my earlier remarks about the self, the notion of the self as being defined by a set of attributes, embodiment, agency, unity, continuity, maybe we will succeed in explaining each of these attributes individually in terms of what's going on in the brain. Then the problem of what is the self will vanish or recede into the background. Third, maybe the solution to the problem of the self won't be a straightforward empirical one. It may instead require a radical shift in perspective, the sort of thing that Einstein did when he rejected the assumption that things can move at arbitrarily high velocities. When we finally achieve such a shift in perspective, we may be in for a big surprise and find that the answer was staring at us all along. I don't want to sound like a New Age guru, but there are curious parallels between this idea and the Hindu philosophical view that there is no essential difference between self and others, or that the self is an illusion. Now, I have no clue what the solution to the problem of self is, what this shift in perspective might be. If I did, I would dash off a paper to Nature today, and overnight I'd be the most famous scientist alive. But just for fun, let me have a crack at it, at what the solution might look like. Our brains are essentially model-making machines. We need to construct useful virtual reality simulations of the world that we can act on. Within the simulation, we need also to construct models of other people's minds, because we're intensely social creatures as primates. We need to do this so we can usefully predict their behavior. We are, after all, the Machiavellian primate. For example, you want to know, was what he did a willful action? In that case, he might repeat it. Or was it involuntary? in which case it's quite benign. Indeed, evolution may have given us the skill even before self-awareness emerged in the brain. But then once this mechanism is in place, you can also apply it to the particular creature who happens to occupy this particular body called Ramachandran. At a very rudimentary level, this is what happens each time a newborn baby mimics your behavior. Stick your tongue out next time you see a newborn baby, and the baby will stick its tongue out, mimicking your behavior, instantly dissolving the boundary, the arbitrary barrier between self and others. And we even know that this is carried out by a specific group of neurons in the brain, in your frontal lobes, called the mirror neurons. The bonus from this might be self-awareness. With this, I'd like to conclude this whole series of lectures. As I said in my first lecture, my goal was not to give you a complete survey of our knowledge of the brain. That would take 50 hours, not 5. But I hope I have succeeded in conveying to you the sense of excitement that my colleagues and I experience each time we try to tackle one of these problems, whether you're talking about hysteria, phantom limbs, free will, the meaning of art, denial, or neglect, or any one of these syndromes which we talked about in earlier lectures. Second, I hope I've convinced you that by studying these strange cases and asking the right questions, we neuroscientists can begin to answer some of those lofty questions that thinking people have been preoccupied with since the dawn of history. What is free will? What is body image? What is the self? Who am I? Questions that until recently were the province of philosophy. No enterprise is more vital for the well-being and survival of the human race. This is just as true now as it was in the past. Remember that politics, colonialism, imperialism, and war also originate in the human brain. Thank you.
Professor Ramachandran, thank you very much indeed. Well, our listeners will recall my mentioning that this is the mecca of neuroscience. So just as we've been fascinated over the past 5 weeks to hear Rama's thesis, we're equally fascinated to know whether his peers buy it, whether our audience here in La Jolla, California, also believe that it's only a matter of time before psychiatry becomes just another branch of neurology, or that consciousness is all a matter of matter, or even if there are some schizophrenics here who might be willing to tickle themselves. So, audience, it's over to you. Can I have a question, please? Lady here.
I'm Julia Kindy, and I'm an art historian. You've covered a lot of ground, from things that I don't understand at all to things that seem more familiar. What about something more common like autism?
Remember I talked about the limbic circuits, the amygdala, the limbic system, the anterior cingulate, receiving information from the sensory systems and reacting to it emotionally. Remember I said in Capgras, this wire that goes from the sensory system to the amygdala is cut. Oddly enough, something similar is going on in autism. What Bill Herstein, a postdoctoral colleague of mine, and I found was, if you show autistic children different types of sensory stimuli, if I show him lions and tigers, sure, he gets a big response. But you can show him shoes and tables, and he gets a huge big jolt. There's no rhyme or reason to his emotional reaction. The connections, I think, between the sensory cortices and the amygdala are somehow deranged. And this makes him attribute falsely high significance to trifles. He may stare at a little particle of dust incessantly, mesmerized. And on the other hand, highly salient stimuli, what you and I would find very salient, like people's eyes, they completely avoid. They don't look at. So there is this distortion of the same connections going from the sensory input to the amygdala. And I'm not saying that's the only cause of autism, but I think that's one major cause.
Gentleman in the white shirt at the back there.
My name's John McGraw, and I'm a philosopher with particular interest in the study of religion. Now, we all know that the brain decays and the brain dies. So where do you come in on the traditional concepts of the soul? Do you think that they are these analgesic type of explanations, or is it something you still have some resonance to but cannot fully explain under the concepts of neuroscience?
Certain patients who have epileptic seizures originating in the temporal lobes will often have intense religious experiences and mystical experiences. And you don't see this as often when the seizures originate elsewhere in the brain. And this led us to suggest, along with Kerry Armel, that maybe there is the activity of the left temporal lobe somehow is conducive to religious belief and to belief in God. And instantly the press sort of got very excited about this and said Ramachandran has found the God module in the brain. I mean, this is a gross exaggeration. I wish I'd found God in the brain. But by the way, even if it's true there are specific parts of the brain involved in religious experience and God, it doesn't invalidate the religious experience for that patient. But it does pose a sort of clinical dilemma, because if you treat the patient with anti-epileptic drugs, or if you do a temporal lobectomy, which you sometimes do for surgery, essentially you're doing a godectomy, okay? And very often the patient's religious belief goes away. But what right do I, a mere physician, have to deprive God of his visitation rights to the patient? Now, go on.
I think you better come back on this one. Yeah.
But where do you stand? Do you believe in the soul or do you not believe in the soul?
Well, I don't believe there is another thing in the conventional sense called soul that survives bodily death. In fact, many theologians in the old days used to weigh people after they died to see if the weight went down slightly because the soul had a certain weight. Needless to say, they didn't find anything. But do I believe in an afterlife? Do I believe in religion and all of that? Like most scientists, I'm agnostic. If you're talking about God in some sort of very abstract sense, like in India, the dance of Shiva, or the Spinoza sense of the word God, then I would say I have no problem with it. But if you're talking about an old guy there who's watching me and making sure I behave myself and that I pray to him every day and that I will be punished in hell if I do something wrong, I don't believe in that. And I don't want to offend anybody here, but I mean, that's my personal view. Yeah.
But is that because of your science? Is that because of what you have learned? Or is that...
Well, it's partly common sense, but...
Okay, and another question. Gentleman here.
Daniel Nettle from the Open University. If and when we fully understand the human brain, what happens to the traditional disciplines like philosophy, psychology, theology, aesthetics, that thought that they studied what it was like to be human? Do they just shut up shop and go home, or...?
Yes. But let me qualify. When you take something like love, somebody says, oh, when you fall in love, these are all the parts of the brain active. The septum is involved in orgasms. These are the peptides released, hypothalamic nuclei. Then maybe there is some prolactin for affiliation, and all of this is activated. So you're in love with this young lady, and I come along, and I'm the neuroscientist, this evil genius, and I do a brain PET scan or whatever, and I show these are all the parts active. This young lady friend of yours looks at it and says, my God, that's all? It's all this bunch of chemicals? What you should say is, my dear, this proves it's all real. I really am in love with you. I'm not faking it. Here's hard evidence. So the notion that once you explain it in terms of what's going on in the neurons is going to somehow eliminate love or eliminate philosophy or eliminate psychology, that's not true, obviously.
I'm Dr. Gilman, Roger Gilman. I'm one of the old people at the Salk Institute across the street. Besides all these neuromediators that you discussed actually in your other lectures, we know now that the brain contains a series of molecules that you just mentioned actually called peptides. Those peptides are actually ubiquitous. They are throughout the brain, but they are not random. They have very specific localizations in the brain. Some of these molecules will trigger extensive thirst, hunger, sexual behavior, fear, anxiety. How do you see the significance of these molecules in abnormal behavior?
Okay, the question is about peptides, many of which you discovered, of course. And we've talked about transmitters in the brain, and these transmitters we usually think of as involved in rapid exchange of information across synapses. The general feeling is, and there's no very strong evidence, that the peptides are involved in more gradual shifts in behavior, shifts in your mind, changes in your emotions, and so maybe very much involved in mental illness. But I think the real problem we are confronted with here is that our knowledge of human emotions is extraordinarily primitive. We don't have an adequate taxonomy of emotions. For example, take vision. We know there are 30 areas in the brain concerned with vision. We know the psychophysics of color vision has been studied in excruciating detail for about 150 years, going back to Helmholtz. But if I ask you what is envy, you don't know more about envy than your grandmother did. But what's going on in the brain? Is there an envy transmitter, an envy peptide, a specific parts of the brain involved? What is the psychophysics of envy? So in other words, we don't really have a sophisticated understanding of our emotional life, a scientific understanding of our emotional life. Until we do that, we cannot begin to systematically map that on to peptides in the brain. But I bet it's going to turn out like the periodic tables. In other words, there's a finite number of peptides, quite a large number, of course, but various combinations of these produce various nuances of emotions, just like you get all the different compounds with different properties based on a finite subset of elements.
We've got time for just 2 or 3 more quick questions, if we could. Let's take one here.
I'm Marlene Damon. I'm a marriage and family counselor and a clinical hypnotherapist. And I must ask you if you've done any research as to what is happening in the brain when someone is hypnotized.
Remember the experiment I told you about hysteria. Here's a patient with the arm paralyzed. There's no brain damage. And you say, move your arm. He tries, it doesn't move. The prefrontal cortex lights up. But in addition, the anterior cingulate and frontal cortex lights up. And we know there's some inhibition kicking in from there, stopping the arm from moving. It turns out the same thing happens in hypnosis. You tell the chap, your left arm is paralyzed completely. And of course, he's completely paralyzed. It doesn't happen in everybody, but people who are susceptible to hypnosis. Now you go and do a brain scan, and you say, move your left arm. He says, no, I can't. He says, try. And he tries, the anterior cingulate lights up. So the same sort of thing happens in hypnosis as in hysteria.
Arthur Olson, molecular biology at the Scripps Research Institute. You talked about PET scans and made me think about my pet. My dog seems to have a sense of itself. I doubt whether it actually contemplates free will, but my question is, what is it that makes us human?
This is a really nice, quick question to end on.
I would say there is something special about humans. I mean, that is what you call reflective self-consciousness. And it's unlikely that dogs, for example, have that. But there's something even more unique about humans, which I don't think any of us can explain yet. You know, sometimes reporters come and ask me, what is it that's absolutely unique about humans? The usual answer is language, humor, you know, we are the laughing primate, we have free will, we can contemplate the consequences of our actions, so on and so forth. But there is one quality which I think is very special, and that is the need to be more than human. In other words, you're constantly confronted with this dilemma. You know that everything that you hear from science and from neurology, that you are a beast, okay? Just a hairless ape, which happens to be a little bit more clever than other apes, okay? At the same time, you don't feel like that. You feel like you're an angel trapped inside this body, constantly trying to, craving immortality, craving transcendence, trying to escape from this body. And this is the essential human predicament.
Rama, it's been a stimulating journey that you've taken us on over the past 5 weeks. I think everyone who's travelled with us, I defy them not to have emerged with an even greater respect for those of you who seek to understand the workings of this 1.5 kilos of jelly, I think you told us it was, inside our skulls, let alone our respect for the jelly itself. You simply leave us, like all good teachers should, really, panting to know more and willing you on in your work to discover more about the subject that's closest of all, I suspect, to our hearts, or should I say to our brains, and that is ourselves. So our thanks to our audience here at the Neurosciences Institute in La Jolla, California, and our thanks for a fascinating series to our Reith Lecturer 2003, Villanor Ramachandran.